Chapter 232, Great Development Technique. When Han Li heard the other person's words, he didn't actually open his mouth to say anything. Instead, he lowered his head and began to think while he tightly grasped the other person's primordial spirit with a single hand that glowed with white light. After a long while, Han Li lifted his head up and said coldly, "If your primordial spirit's invasion had taken me by surprise, would you have had mercy on me? Your magic power is much deeper than mine, even though we are both at Foundation establishment. More likely than not, I would have been consumed by you." Han Li's words were overflowing with ill intent. "I can tell you a secret and give you an exceptional cultivation technique." Senior Marshal Brother Li was greatly frightened and began to send transmissions through his primordial spirit. Secret cultivation technique. Could this be the great development technique of your 1,000 bamboo school? Han Li's indifferent sentence immediately caused the primordial spirit's green light to flash. In addition, it began to transmit with shock, stuttering. "How do you know of this matter? You're the person who was snooping yesterday." At this time, Senior Marshal Brother Lin finally realized what had happened. "Okay, since you know that I am not clueless about your situation, you should obediently tell me everything. You wouldn't want me to immediately destroy your primordial spirit." Although Han Li spoke very casually, this caused Senior Marshal Brother Lin's primordial spirit to tremble in his hand. Didn't Junior Marshal Brother pretty much hear all that there was to say yesterday? Senior Marshal Brother Lin let out a long sigh and asked faintly. Meanwhile, those people from the 1,000 Bamboo School outside the formation, seeing that no response came after they transmitted their words through the large formation, couldn't help but be shamed into anger. They released their puppet beasts, unleashing a new round of attacks. The large formation became lively once again, but the interior of the formation was still just as calm as before apart from some noise and aftershocks. "Junior Marshal Brother, what strange formation is this? It can actually withstand this fierce attack. It truly is unbelievable." Senior Marshal Brother Lin interjected upon seeing this scene. He purposefully acted surprised and spoke. "HMPH, don't worry about my formation, and don't recklessly change the subject either. I have absolutely no interest in the internal strife of your 1,000 Bamboo School. All I want to know is whether you have a portion of the Great Development Technique, and if you gain any remarkable abilities as you cultivate it. If you want to purposefully stall for time, I will immediately destroy you," Han Li said, his tone suddenly becoming cold as he knitted his eyebrows. Next, the white light on his hand abruptly flourished, and with a gentle force of his finger, he instantly caused Senior Marshal Brother Lin's primordial spirit to cry out repeatedly that he wouldn't dare. "This great development technique is the original secret technique created by my sect's founding ancestor. It is a secret technique specifically used to greatly increase one's divine sense, as well as to split one's primordial spirit. This is also a necessary cultivation technique for our 1,000 Bamboo School to cultivate in order to use the puppets. Only when one has cultivated this technique can one imprint one's divine sense on all the numerous puppets and control them with ease. Otherwise, even if I were to refine more puppets, what use would they be to me if I couldn't control them all at once?" Senior Marshal Brother Lin said unhurriedly, not daring to procrastinate after tasting Han Li's methods. "Since it is a basic cultivation technique of the 1,000 Bamboo School, why would you still need to scheme about it? You even mentioned something about another half. What was your fight all about?" Han Li continued to ask expressionlessly. "Not much to hide. Although the Great Development Technique is a foundational cultivation technique of my 1,000 Bamboo School, the fundamental teachings of our school cannot be easily spread to the public. Thus, the Great Development Technique that the 1,000 Bamboo School's disciples cultivate is only the abridged version of the first layer. Although it is easy to cultivate, even after completely cultivating it, it is still far from the strength of the first layer of the actual Great Development Technique. In addition, the real manual for the Great Development Technique can only be cultivated by the high-level cultivators in the sect. The people outside must have all cultivated the first 2 layers of the actual Great Development Technique to be able to control nearly 100 mechanical puppets at once. Because I have cultivated the 3rd layer of this technique, I am even better than them and can control 300 at once. However, only the school master and his successors have the right to cultivate the Great Development Technique past the 3rd layer. During a rebellion within the 1,000 Bamboo Sect, my father was plotted against by the current school master, Jin Nanshan. Even the entire Great Development Technique manual was forcefully taken away. I, as the young schoolmaster, was taking care of business outside of the school at the time. Because I had no way to resist the situation, I could only find a substitute to fake my death and left, hiding in the state of UA, 5,000 kilometers away. At that time, although I didn't have the entire great development technique, because I was the only son of the schoolmaster, I still knew the cultivation technique for the first 4 layers. Thus, I compiled it all into the first half of the great development technique. Originally, I had wanted to spend the last years of my life here, but who knew that my breakthrough to the 3rd layer of the great development technique was just around the corner. This caused my desire for revenge to greatly rise. In a moment of confusion, I contacted a group of my loyal subordinates, asking them to steal the incantations for the final 3 layers for me, but who knew that my fate would turn out this way. I don't know if they were captured after failing to steal it, or if they directly betrayed me. Senior Marshal Brother Lin spoke slowly this time and in great detail, but when he reached the end, his voice was filled with wrath and objection. Han Li coldly watched the other person's primordial spirit vent its anger and didn't make any moves. When the other person had finally calmed down somewhat, he continued to interrogate without politeness. What exactly is the secret that you just mentioned? I hope that. Stay your hand, I'll speak, I'll tell you right now. Senior Marshal Brother Lin's primordial spirit hesitated a little bit as if it wanted to bring up some conditions. However, Han Li didn't even give him the opportunity to speak any further. He directly gave the other person another taste of suffering, almost shattering Senior Marshal Brother Lin's primordial spirit. This caused the other person to immediately change his tune, panic-stricken. If you won't do this the easy way, we'll do it the hard way. It's best if you don't raise any conditions before telling me everything that I want to hear. Han Li's tone was cold and bone-piercing. Senior Marshal Brother Lin had been completely shaken by Han Li's vicious tactics. He said hurriedly with fright. In actuality, this secret is related to the great development technique. In addition, it has been widely spread in the upper echelons of the 1,000 Bamboo School. It's only that nobody knows whether or not it's true. However, when my father was still here, he secretly told me that there was a 50 to 60% chance that this secret was true. I don't know when it started, but in the upper echelons of our 1,000 Bamboo School, a rumor was secretly spread that anyone who cultivated the great development technique to a high enough layer could form their core much more easily than regular cultivators, and it would be easier for them to break through the bottlenecks in their cultivation. This was because the previous schoolmaster's heir's success rate of forming his core was extraordinarily high. After a brief pause, he still told Han Li the secret. It can raise one's chances of entering the core formation stage. The originally cold-faced Han Li finally changed his expression. Yes, if Junior Marshal Brother is willing to help me find a corpse so that I can refine and control it, I'm willing to share the incantation for the first 4 layers with Junior Marshal Brother. Afterward, we can join forces and devise a way to take the remaining layers from the son of that thief surnamed Jin. Then we can reach core formation together. Wouldn't it be much faster? He began to move his non-existent mouth again, attempting to entice Han Li. Han Li snorted and remained silent. He lowered his head and entered deep contemplation once again, causing Senior Marshal Brother Lin to instantly feel uneasy yet again. There is only a 50 or 60% chance that it can raise one's success rate for core formation. Han Li suddenly raised his head and muttered, his eyebrows tightly locked together. Junior Marshal Brother, a 50 to 60% chance is already pretty good. After all, this is related to the formation of a gold core. You should at least try it. Senior Marshal Brother Lin added hastily upon seeing this. In reality, what his father had told him was not actually a 50 to 60% chance, but rather a 30% chance. As his words were leaving his mouth, the success rate had been doubled. Is this great development technique easy to cultivate? Apart from increasing one's divine sense, can it increase one's cultivation base? In addition, how long has Senior Marshal Brother Lin been in the foundation establishment stage, and how long have you been cultivating this great development technique? Han Li suddenly asked coldly, raising his eyebrows. Cultivating speed is decent, and it can add ever so slightly to your cultivation base. I successfully reached foundation establishment over 100 years ago. At that time, I was only 20 years old. I started cultivating the great development technique after reaching foundation establishment. Why does Junior Marshal Brother ask these questions? Senior Marshal Brother Lin had never thought that the other person would suddenly ask a train of questions. After staring blankly for a moment, he could only stammer and answer the first 2 questions because he had not had time to prepare his defenses. However, he answered the last 2 questions very clearly. Han Li's expression relaxed as if he were very satisfied with the other person's responses. However, The right hand that was holding onto Senior Marshal Brother Lin's primordial spirit suddenly flashed with bright white light. Then, he tightly closed his fingers. The primordial spirit in his hand only had time to let out a tragic yell before it instantly became dots of starlight, forever disappearing from this world. What a terrible coincidence. The thing I hate the most is being possessed by other people. This reminded me of some unpleasant things. In addition, although I am truly piqued by the great development technique, it is difficult to cultivate and cannot increase one's magic power. How could I cultivate it as my primary cultivation technique? If my magic power hadn't even been cultivated to the peak of the foundation establishment stage, what use would the great development technique be to me even if I were to cultivate it diligently? This fellow's natural talent was pretty good, but after cultivating this great development technique for nearly 100 years, he was still only at the peak of the third layer, and because he was distracted, his magic power hovered around that of the mid-foundation establishment stage. Fish and a bear's paw, how could they be so easily linked together? In addition, there is nothing strange about the Thousand Bamboo School's previous schoolmaster being able to balance the two and form a golden core. Since he could become a head of a school, he definitely would possess a peerless innate talent and could be considered a 1 in 10,000 genius. Thus, the credibility of the claim that the great development technique can increase one's chances of forming one's core is even lower. I am definitely not considered a genius, so I have no faith that I can cultivate both my own magic power and the great development technique to any deep point. TL, a fish and a bear's paw means you can't have your cake and eat it too. The worst is that he doesn't even possess the entire great development technique. He even wants me to become an enemy of a sect school. Isn't this just bringing about my own destruction? Even if I were to let you go, who could guarantee that you wouldn't bear a grudge about today's matters and use underhanded methods behind my back? Please tell me, with all these reasons, how could I let you go? Han Li muttered to himself, looking at the right hand that had taken the life of a foundation establishment cultivator. Chapter 233, Lei Wan. As it stood, this was the second cultivator whom Han Li had eliminated after his primordial spirit abandoned his body. Within battles, most cultivators wouldn't separate their primordial spirit from their body as it required a certain amount of time to perform. During this period of time, one could not move about freely. During a battle between cultivators who would give their enemy enough time to escape, long before one would have the time to separate their primordial spirit from their body, they would have already died more than 10 times. Furthermore, only those in the nascent soul stage or later would be able to separate their primordial spirit from their body in an instant with the help of their nascent soul. This senior marshal brother Lin was just as unfortunate as that Yu Zhidong. Note, Yu Zhidong was the primordial spirit inside Dr. Mo. He originally thought to pass through the location of Han Li's Immortals Cave and head straight to Yellow Maple Valley for treatment and protection. However, he accidentally burst into Han Li's great formation and was completely trapped in the shifting illusions of the formation, unable to escape in the slightest. He helplessly looked on as the poison spread through his body and could only detach his primordial spirit from its corporeal vessel. This also caused Senior Marshal Brother Lin to hold resentment towards the Great Formation's master, because he required a flesh body to be revived and assumed Han Li to be his killer. He thought to seize Han Li's body regardless of the consequences. However, he didn't think in the least that Han Li would be so swift that he could stop Senior Marshal Brother Lin's primordial spirit, even after being caught off guard, and exterminate him. Now that this person was already dead, Han Li naturally didn't think about the dead man's words in the slightest. He now had to deal with the great problem that was lying outside of his Immortals Cave. Although the attacks of the Thousand Bamboo School were frightening, Han Li didn't see a single trace of damage on his great formation, putting him at great ease. Furthermore, he was confident that these people wouldn't dare to stay here too long. Although this place was remote and could be considered the outskirts of the Taiyue mountain range, it was still an area within Yellow Maple Valley's influence. After performing such loud movements, Han Li did not believe that they weren't afraid of the consequences. He reckoned that, even though their current attacks weren't effective against the Great Formation, they had already reached the stage where it was hard to stop halfway. TL, hard to stop halfway, originally Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. After riding a tiger, it is hard to get off. Actually, Han Li wasn't against the idea of handing over Senior Marshal Brother Lin's corpse to send them on their way. However, the trace of one's primordial spirit leaving their body was far too obvious. When they acquire the body, they would only pursue the matter even further. Thus it would be better to make like an ostrich and hide within the Great Formation. In any case, the other party couldn't break through this 5 elements reversal formation. With this said, Han Li could only praise himself. He actually had such foresight to set up his great formation at the very first chance. Otherwise, he would certainly have become their prisoner without the slightest of resistance. However, although there currently appeared to be no problem with the Great Formation, Han Li didn't dare to return to his immortal's cave and sleep. He simply took a stone chair out from his home and sat down and rested his eyes. Since these people used puppets to attack, Han Li was somewhat worried about a persistent attack. After a whole 2 hours of indiscriminate attacks, the Great Formation finally showed the first sign of change. The formation that was originally as peaceful as water began to flicker with dim azure light. The formation covering the sky began to ripple like water from the light arrow and light beam attacks coming from above. Seeing this, those from the 1,000 Bamboo School began to grow excited. After all, seeing this kind of change meant that the formation could be destroyed by force. With more strength, it was possible to burst the formation open. In truth, if the barrier maintained its originally peaceful appearance, Huang Long and company would have decided to retreat. Just as the 1,000 Bamboo School planned an even greater offensive, and Han Li's expression slightly changed. A thunderous roar came from the distance. "You dare to cause such ruckus in the Tai Yue mountain range, and even dare to attack our sect disciples' immortals' cave. Since you are tired of living, this old man will send you off." This roar left Han Li, who was protected by the Great Formation, with his ears ringing and with a pale complexion, not to mention those outside of the formation. Having directly heard the roar, they were swaying side to side, nearly falling off their boat. "It's a core formation cultivator, quickly retreat." Although Huang Long seemed to be the crude and ferocious sort, he was actually the shrewdest among them. Thus, after he heard this person's voice contained such power, his face lost color, and he immediately wanted to escape. But it was clear that Huang Long had underestimated the flight speed and the immeasurable magic power of a core formation cultivator. Just as those several people were putting away their puppets in a panic and intending to escape, thunder and lightning suddenly appeared on the horizon. White light flew across the sky, closely followed by a strand of silver light. In a blink of an eye, it arrived in front of them, scaring them so much that their spirits nearly left their body. They were unable to retrieve the remaining puppets and instead jumped up to escape individually. However, the huge streak of silver light that spanned over 30 meters simply didn't give Huang Long and company any chance. The streak of light suddenly separated into 6 or 7 smaller silver light streaks, surrounding those from the 1,000 Bamboo School, all of whom were already in mid-flight. "Senior, please spare our lives, we." Huang Long grew terrified, and he hastily wanted to say something. However, these silver lights didn't stop in the slightest. They lightly coiled around them. Then, after several soft thunderclaps, these people who were vainly trying to escape had all turned to ash. Huang Long did not have the fortune to escape this end. At this moment, all of the silver lights converged into one, revealing a very large fatty. All that was seen of his eyes were 2 slits. His chins were folded with many layers. It was unknown how many there truly were. In addition, his waist was as thick as a barrel. This was undoubtedly the fattest person Han Li had seen in his lifetime. But it was this very person who was able to become a core formation cultivator. Furthermore, from the techniques he used, it seemed that he had lightning attribute mutated spiritual roots. This caused Han Li to be greatly shocked. Regardless of the newcomer's appearance, this person did break Han Li's encirclement. Furthermore, this person was an elder from Yellow Maple Valley. As a result, after Han Li witnessed the extermination of the fellows from 1,000 Bamboo School, Han Li opened his great formation without the slightest of hesitation and hastily flew up on a magic tool to greet him. When he was in front of the fatty, Han Li respectfully saluted him. "Marshal Nephew Han Li, pay his respects to Marshal Senior. Great thanks to this Marshal Senior's assistance. If it weren't for Marshal Senior, my life may not have been guaranteed." Ever since Han Li was flying up, the fatty had been sizing up Han Li with his eye slits. When he saw Han Li respectfully greet him, his huge face revealed a slight smile. It seemed he had a pretty good first impression toward Han Li. "I am your Marshal Senior, Lei Wan. You can call me Marshal Senior Lei. How could these people from the 1,000 Bamboo School attack you without cause? Could it be that you provoked them?" The fatty dove straight to the heart of the matter. It could clearly be seen that this Marshal Senior Lei was a shrewd person who wasn't easily fooled. "TL Lei Wan. His name means thunder 10,000 cranes." Han Li inwardly shivered, but with his expression remained calm as always. He gave this marshal senior an explanation while omitting some unnecessary details. Naturally, Han Li did not mention his affairs at the Heavenly Star Sect's Market City or his extermination of Senior Marshal Brother Lin's primordial spirit. Lei Wan remained calm throughout the explanation, but when he heard that Senior Marshal Brother Lin had died from poison while inside the formation, he said, "So he turned out to be a fellow from the Thousand Bamboo School. I knew when we took him into Yellow Maple Valley that this person would certainly bring trouble. However, I didn't think that after so many years, there would still be people sent to kill him. That great school Master Jin's mindset is quite narrow." This Marshal Senior Lei Wan didn't reveal any sorrow. After a light sigh he asked, "Where is Marshal Nephew Lin's corpse? Lead me to it." "As you wish, Marshal Senior, this way." How could Han Li dare to refuse? He hastily led him into his great formation. As Han Li walked, he was inwardly rejoicing. Fortunately, since he had been busy with those from the Thousand Bamboo School, he didn't touch the storage pouch on Senior Marshal Lin's body. Otherwise, the situation would become unsightly. "Yi, this great formation of yours is rather unusual. It seems that even if I didn't come, those scoundrels still wouldn't have been able to do anything to you." Not long after Lei Wan entered the Five Elements reversal formation, he made out a few of its intricacies. "He, these are merely high-grade formation flags that I exchanged for quite a bit of money from the Market City. How could they enter Marshal Senior's eyes?" When Han Li heard the fatty's praise, he could not help but rejoice inwardly, but he still spoke quite modestly. "No, this formation spell of yours has a great origin. Even if I were to try to break through this formation without using any tricks, it would be quite difficult to break through." Lei Wan shook his head as if he were beating a drum with it, continuously disagreeing. At this moment the two had arrived. Senior Marshal Brother Lin's corpse was openly lying on his body, completely intact. When the fatty saw this, he waved the pair of fans in his hands. The corpse immediately flew to the pair of palm leaf fans. Lei Wan then examined the body without restraint. "It seems what you said was true. The Far East's venomous poison sect's poison has spread throughout his body." After the fatty finished his inspection, he nodded his head, but his following words caused Han Li to inwardly shiver. However, before his body had completely decayed, his primordial spirit should have left his body. Perhaps Marshal Nephew Han Li has seen it. The fatty threw the corpse onto the ground and calmly asked Han Li. Chapter 234, Restrictions in Spiritual Medicine. When Han Li heard this, he secretly said in his heart, "Sure enough, he asked about this matter." However, he still appeared stunned outwardly and exclaimed, "Primordial spirit. This disciple has not seen any sort of primordial spirit. Could Senior Marshal Brother Li's primordial spirit have left his body before he died?" Han Li had decided in his heart long ago that as long as the other person asked about the primordial spirit, he would insist that he didn't know anything. Could he really tell his Marshal Senior that he had extinguished the primordial spirit after it tried to possess him? "You didn't see it." The fatty gazed at Han Li for a while with an enigmatic smile. His gaze caused Han Li's to feel unsettled, and his heart thumped repeatedly. "Amen, since you didn't see it, Senior Marshal Brother Lin's primordial spirit could have been lost inside the Great Formation and dissipated on its own," the fatty said indifferently, his face twisting after a moment. Hearing this, Han Li let out a sigh. However, he was very clear in his heart that the fatty did not believe what he said, but based on Marshal Senior Lei's seemingly nonchalant attitude towards Senior Marshal Brother Lin's survival, he would not investigate too seriously. After all, everyone knew that the first thing a cultivator's primordial spirit would do after leaving the body was to immediately attempt to take over someone else in order to be revived. However, apart from Han Li, no other cultivators were present in the formation, so the only body that could be possessed would have been Han Li's. Since Han Li was still fine, it could only mean that Senior Marshal Brother Lin had failed to possess his body, and his primordial spirit had been eliminated. As for whether or not Han Li's body had been appropriated by Senior Marshal Brother Lin's primordial spirit, could Senior Marshal Brother Lin be controlling Han Li's physical body? The answer was even more obvious at a glance. This was because possessing someone was very harmful to the primordial spirit. Even if the possession was successful, there was simply no way to control someone else's body freely without spending at least a week to recover behind closed doors. Naturally, this Marshal Senior Lei could see through it. Thus, both Han Li and Lei Wan were both well aware of how Senior Marshal Brother Lin's primordial spirit met his end. However, because his initial impression of Han Li was pretty good, and he was too lazy to ask about this kind of matter, this fatty allowed the topic to pass somewhat carelessly. On the other hand, Han Li, who understood clearly what was happening, still pretended to be confused because he knew that no matter what his reasons were, if this matter were to spread, he could not escape from the offense of mutilating a cultivator from the same sect. This would be very unfavorable towards him. But in this way, Han Li actually felt that this Marshal Senior Lei was much more pleasant than his own master. Marshal Nephew's cave is truly too crude. How can you welcome outsiders in this way? Although we cultivators aren't too concerned with these things, it still has to be at least barely passable. For some reason, this Marshal Senior Lei didn't leave this location after finishing up his business. Instead, he stood at the entrance to Han Li's cave and began to slowly evaluate. Upon hearing this, Han Li bitterly laughed for a moment. He had only used a few days to leisurely construct this cave. How could he find time to be meticulous? However, Han Li thought of another matter after hearing his Marshal Senior mention this. Thus, after laughing briefly, he respectfully said to Lei Wan, "Marshal Nephew has a few matters that I want to ask Marshal Senior Lei about. Can Marshal Senior Lei come into this disciple's cave and rest for a moment, so that this disciple can slowly explain it to Marshal Senior Lei? In addition, this disciple has a few mature medicinal herbs. I want to ask Marshal Senior to appraise them, so that this disciple can use them to refine pills with reassurance." Medicinal ingredients. The fatty's expression originally did not change when he heard that Han Li had some questions for him and wanted him to enter his cave. However, when Han Li mentioned that he had a few old medicinal herbs, a trace of a smile appeared on his face, and he nodded in agreement. Thus, Han Li invited Lei Wan into the hollow, large entrance hall. Then, he said he would go and retrieve his spiritual herbs and asked Lei Wan to wait for a brief moment. Afterward, he hurried into his storage room and retrieved 2 600- or 700-year-old herbs, then returned to the lobby. Han Li didn't carry those few spiritual medicines inside of his storage pouch with him at all times to preserve their medicinal properties over a long period of time. Using jade boxes or other similar magic tools to store spiritual medicines was only a temporary method. Over long periods of time, its medicinal strength would still slowly leach away. Thus, practically every cultivator's cave had a secret storage room. Only in this way could one guarantee the medicinal properties of the spiritual medicine would not be lost. However, because Han Li was worried that this Marshal Senior Lei's spiritual sense was extraordinary, thus allowing him to see the items hidden in his storage room as well as the spirit well spring, he had activated the 5 elements reversal formation spiritual sense, blocking magic much earlier. Now, if this Marshal Senior Lei wanted to snoop around, he would most likely be very disappointed at this moment. That Jade slip had made it very clear that breaking off one's spiritual sense was very simple to implement as an additional ability, so when this ability had been refined into the set of magic tools, it was similar in strength to the complete formation, not weaker than it in the slightest. This was also the only effect in which it was comparable to the complete formation. After Han Li had set up the large formation, he had once tested the strength of this ability. As expected, his spiritual sense could only spread a few feet around him. There was simply no way for him to further increase the range of his spiritual sense. As for this Marshal Senior Lei, even though he was a core formation cultivator, and his spiritual sense would inevitably surpass Han Li's, he most likely would not be able to search beyond the 100-foot-long entrance hall. This was also the reason why he dared to invite the other person in. Otherwise, the other person could use his spiritual sense to sweep both the secret storage room and the spirit well spring that he had sealed up. He believed that this Marshal Senior Lei Wan most likely did not harbor any ill intentions. However, it would probably have been worse if he hadn't invited this Marshal Senior Lei into his cave at the beginning, which would only serve to increase the fatty's suspicions. After all, if a Marshal Senior were to arrive in front of a junior's cave but wasn't invited into the cave, it would truly be somewhat out of the ordinary. Even if the other person were to overlook it initially, once they thought about it carefully after the fact, wouldn't it be even more of a disaster? In addition, there were some things that Han Li actually wanted to ask this fat Marshal Senior, and he genuinely wanted to develop some connections with this person. After all, he was a core formation cultivator. If Han Li were to build up a positive relationship with this Marshal Senior, it would be very beneficial to him in the future. As Han Li quietly thought this to himself, he held 2 medicinal boxes in his hand and walked into the entrance hall. Then, in front of Lei Wan, He took off the covers of the boxes one by one, asking the other person to perform the so-called identification. At this time, Lei Wan felt very unhappy in his heart. This was because he had actually sent out his spiritual sense when Han Li went to retrieve the medicinal ingredients, wanting to survey and size up the extent of his cave. This wasn't because he had any malicious intentions. Rather, it was a subconscious action that he performed as a core formation cultivator. However, his spiritual sense had only left his body a distance of roughly 100 feet before it could not continue to disperse even an inch. It felt incredibly sluggish, as if 500 kilograms had been placed on his spiritual sense. This caused Lei Wan's large face to immediately reveal an expression of shock. It wasn't that he had never been in circumstances where his spiritual sense was limited. He had experienced these circumstances many times in the caves of cultivators he had good relations with. This meant that there were some restrictions in place that could cut off one's spiritual sense. However, his friends were all core formation cultivators. The fact that their caves had these kinds of restrictions was not so strange. However, this martial nephew was clearly a foundation establishment cultivator, and this cave appeared to have been constructed not long ago. For this kind of restriction to appear in this cave was quite strange indeed. Lei Wan did not actually connect the appearance of this restriction with the formation outside of the cave. This was because to him, it was already very impressive for the large formation outside the cave to have such a strong defense. If it could also be manipulated to break off one's spiritual sense, wouldn't it be similar to the great protector formations of some small sects? How could such a strong restrictive formation appear outside of a foundation establishment cultivator's cave? This Lei Wan most likely never could have imagined that Han Li's formation was actually the simplified version of the widely known 5 elements reversal formation. Even if its magic power was only 1/10 that of the original formation, it would not be much worse than a city faction's great formation. Thus, when Han Li opened the medicine boxes for him to look at, the fatty's heart was still pondering this matter. His gaze did not actually immediately go towards the contents of the box. It was as if it didn't matter whether he looked inside the box or not. However, when his gaze finally landed upon the 600 or 700-year-old medicinal herbs, his originally laid-back attitude immediately disappeared. As for restrictions and spiritual sense, he tossed these to the back of his mind. At this time, Lei Wan's eyes existed solely for these 2 medicinal herbs that released a very pressing spiritual qi. This disciple bought these 2 spiritual medicines in the secular world for quite a few spirit stones. However, Martial Nephew's experience was too shallow, and I had no way of determining the age of the medicine, which is why I never used them. Martial Senior Lei's arrival today is very timely. You can help Martial Nephew identify them. Amen. Lei Wan didn't hear what Han Li said at all. He carelessly, Amen, ed a few times before carefully picking up a spiritual medicine and scrutinizing it in detail. Han Li secretly watched the other person's expressions very carefully and lightly smiled in his heart. It seemed he had picked the correct spiritual medicines. He had heard others mention that core formation cultivators' need for spiritual medicine greatly surpassed that of foundation establishment cultivators. After reaching the realm of core formation, one mustn't easily say that they wished to turn their core into a nascent soul. It wasn't a matter of simply cultivating one's magic power a layer higher. It was a matter that was beyond difficult. Thus, taking lots of medicinal pills became the common way for core formation cultivators to raise their magic power. Chapter 235, Han Li's Intentions. The common medicine pills of this world were of no use to a core formation cultivator. Only medicine pills refined with medicine ingredients that were aged over several hundred years, and a few spiritual medicines that were born from heaven and earth, could increase the speed of their cultivation. Thus, core formation cultivators would have to travel far and spend a majority of their time to search and scrape together extremely rare medicinal ingredients. This was also why when Li Hueyuan saw the great amount of spiritual medicine Han Li took out from the forbidden area, he fundamentally thought of every means to immediately accept him as a disciple. He was truly too covetous toward these spiritual medicines of heaven and earth. Actually, even if Li Hueyuan hadn't been the one to bring the group to the forbidden area, and it was instead Lei Wan or another core formation cultivator, it was unlikely they would have let a portion of Han Li's spiritual medicine slip by. In most cases, they would have used a similar trick. Li Hueyuan, on the other hand, was truly a bit stingy and only made Han Li an in-name disciple. However, taking medicine pills was only of assistance toward progressing one's magic power. They still had to seclude themselves in meditation and absorb spiritual chi for a time. Bitter and diligent cultivation was the true way to turn spiritual chi into one's own magic power. Otherwise, if one took medicine pills and didn't spend time to refine spiritual chi afterwards, it would be of no effect and wouldn't increase one's magic power in the slightest. After all, external spiritual chi and one's magic power were fundamentally two different things. There were also ancient records of people who took heaven-defying medicine pills, resulting in their bodies exploding. As a result, wanton use of medicine pill beyond one's limits could be extremely dangerous. In addition to increasing magic power, when one encountered a bottleneck, using the spiritual power of the medicine pill to break through was a common action taken by many cultivators. Its common use further proved its efficacy. Cultivators who could break through bottlenecks without drawing the support of medicinal power were far too few in number in the cultivation world. Furthermore, they were all geniuses who appeared only once every 100 years. Those possessing heavenly spiritual roots were the ones with the greatest aptitude. But when those possessing mutated spiritual roots came across a bottleneck, they had no method to break through without using medicine pills. They were similar to those possessing ordinary spiritual roots in this aspect. This cultivator Lei Wan happened to have come across this sort of bottleneck. Thus, in order to refine supplementary medicine pills, he had gone on a search in the secular world and had just returned. However, on this trip, he didn't have much luck at all. Apart from 2 medicinal herbs that were slightly older than 400 years old, he had ended up empty-handed. This caused him to hold a belly full of grievances. This was also the primary reason why he immediately killed the cultivators from the 1,000 Bamboo School when he laid eyes on them. If he hadn't vented his feelings at that very moment, his mood would likely not have improved for quite a long time. It could only be said that Huang Long and his company were too unfortunate and happened to run into this foul-mooded demon. Up to this moment, Lei Wan's mood was continuously fluctuating. In his 300-year-long experience as a cultivator, he had never seen such spiritual herbs before. When these 2 spiritual herbs entered his eyes, he immediately made an accurate judgment of their age. He couldn't help but become exalted after doing so. He was currently planning to refine soul-strengthening pills, but was lacking medicinal herbs that had reached a maturity of 500 years. Thus, he went on this trip that had nearly taken a full year. However, after browsing everywhere, including the state of UA's large and small market cities as well as the great medicine stores of the mortal world, he still hadn't found any medicinal ingredients that satisfied him. He could only reluctantly take the 2 mediocre 400-year-old herbs and make his preparations. However, he knew in his heart that using these spiritual herbs to refine the soul-strengthening pills wouldn't be enough. Perhaps their medicinal efficacy would be greatly reduced when he created them and wouldn't be of much assistance to him. However, he truly did not have any appropriate core medicines at hand. Could he even refine them? He continued his search, but he only ended up squandering his time. Even if a great medicinal ingredient had actually appeared somewhere, it would have long been hastily acquired by a cultivation sect or clan. By the time he arrived, there wouldn't be a single strand of medicine left. As for the cultivation worlds of nearby countries, looking there would be even more uncertain. That was why when he heard that this martial nephew had medicinal ingredients of a certain maturity, his heart beated. He decided to take a look, entering the incomparably crude and simple cave dwelling. Actually, Lei Wan thought to himself, how could a foundation establishment disciple possibly stumble on good medicinal ingredients? It's most likely a 200- or 300-year-old medicinal herb. After all, he had searched for such a long time, but could only acquire 400-year-old medicinal ingredients. This was also because he was a core formation expert. No one dared to compete with him over them. All of a sudden, this pair of 600- to 700-year-old medicinal herbs before him. This caused him to become absolutely baffled and overly joyous from the surprise. Thus, although it seemed that his eyes were staring at the 2 medicinal herbs, appraising it, he was actually already considering how he would ask this martial nephew to hand it over to him. After all, leaving such rare items in this martial nephew's hand would be far too much of a waste. They would reach their greatest potential in the hands of this great cultivator Lei if he refined them into pills. However, he was also an old fox of many years. He had already thought of a good excuse in the blink of an eye. He coughed 2 times, and after reluctantly returning the medicinal herbs to the case, He turned his nearly obscured neck toward Han Li and amiably said, "These two medicinal herbs are truly rarely seen items of value. They are over 600 and 700 years of age. Martial nephew must have spilled quite a bit of blood to acquire them." That's right, this disciple spent quite a bit of strength to acquire them from an auction at a secret store. At that time, there was also a 1,000-year-old spiritual herb that appeared. Unfortunately, this disciple lacked the power to acquire it. He could only helplessly look on as others bought it. This caused disciple to feel rather regretful, Han Li replied with half-truths. A secret store even had 1,000-year-old herbs. When the fatty heard this, he nearly jumped up from his stone seat. Hearing Han Li speak of this regretful affair, he felt so much distress. It was as if his heart was being gouged out. To think that a core formation cultivator who racked his brain on how to find spiritual herbs and spiritual medicines and visited secret stores of all locations and even 7 or 8 clans could miss such a fortuitous event such as this. If he had been there, no such treasure would be able to escape his grasp. Even if he had to spend more spirit stones, he absolutely would be willing to. As he thought of such an extremely rare and great opportunity, he looked at the brat before him who had let it go. Panting with rage, the fatty wanted to boldly hold Han Li's neck in his hands and interrogate him. He would do this despite clearly knowing that the other party was a Foundation establishment disciple who couldn't afford such an extremely expensive item. Fine, a miss is a miss. Perhaps there will be another opportunity in the future. The fatty eventually calmed himself down and had no choice but to reluctantly say a few words of comfort toward Han Li. After all, he still planned to acquire his 2 spiritual herbs. He couldn't let these herbs slip from his fingers. "Martial nephew Han, how do you intend to use these 2 spiritual herbs? Could it be that you're thinking of handing it over to the sect's pill-refining experts? But as your martial senior, I must warn you that the pill-refining experts in our Yellow Maple Valley are truly terrible. If you were to deliver such precious items to them, they would absolutely extort you. Your losses would be truly great," the fatty advised, using the sincere and earnest manner of an elder. "How could I give it to them to refine? Disciple intended to use these spiritual medicines to exchange for a few items. After all, just to buy these medicinal herbs, this disciple nearly lost a family fortune. How could I easily squander them?" Han Li shook his head. His words caused Lei Wan to feel greatly surprised, making him choke on his previously prepared script. However, the fatty had a second thought. This martial nephew wants items in exchange for the medicinal herbs. Is that all he wants? On the basis of my own status as a core formation expert, apart from those extremely scarce pill and tool refining ingredients, how could I not satisfy this disciple? This is a good opportunity to fairly and honorably exchange for it. With this thought, Lei Wan's eyes grew more squinted from smiling, making him appear increasingly more amiable. What items does martial nephew Han want? The collection that this martial senior has procured over the past several hundred years is not small. Perhaps I have items that will satisfy martial nephew, the fatty happily stated as he blinked his small eyes. Ah, could it be that martial senior wants these spiritual herbs? If it's like that, this disciple can give a herb to martial senior as a junior's filial offering. At this moment, Han Li appeared to have realized this and quickly spoke with reverence. When Lei Wan saw that Han Li was so quick-witted to actually not bring up the matter of the exchange, and instead immediately offer an herb as a gift, he could not help but feel greatly happy. Han Li also became increasingly more pleasant to look at. However, the fatty's goal was both of the herbs. There was still 1 herb left, and he would hate to have to let it go. As a result, Lei Wan waved his hand and grandly said, "Martial nephew Han, what is this? Could it be that I, Lei Wan, am someone who covets the items of his juniors? Do not hesitate to say what you need. Martial Senior will immediately find it and exchange with you fairly. I absolutely won't let Martial Nephew suffer any losses. Do you want to exchange it for a top-grade magic tool or any medicinal pills that you currently need?" When Han Li heard the other party's grand words, he grew greatly happy. He had maneuvered in such a large circle, waiting for these words to be spoken out loud. However, with his outward appearance hesitant, he said in embarrassment, "I will not hide this from Martial Senior Lei. Disciple is very interesting in the Tao of pill refinement. However, the storage room in Yue Lu Hall doesn't have any practical pill refining recipes." Disciple later found out that the pill refining skills of ancient times has nearly died out. The current pill refining skills of my fellow martial disciples and seniors were all either bitterly researched for several tens of generations or happened to be discovered from ancient ruins. Each are as precious as one's own life and are not easily acquired. Thus, Disciple intended to use these two spiritual herbs to exchange for pill formulas that he could use for himself. Chapter 236 Ancient Formula. Chapter 236 Ancient Formula. Exchange for pill formulas. The fatty's originally smiling expression instantly froze. This disciple knows that pill formulas are precious to every martial brother and senior, so I won't be too picky. It's enough as long as it can slightly raise this disciple's cultivating speed and foundation establishment. I will definitely not pick and choose, Han Li said very sincerely. After a certain conversation with the small old man from whom Han Li had learned about the circumstances behind pill formulas in the cultivating world, he racked his brains on how to obtain a few pill formulas for his own uses. After all, he owned a secret technique for ripening medicinal herbs. How could he not exploit this advantage as much as he could? However, the slightly better pill formulas all landed in the hands of core formation cultivators. Even if foundation establishment disciples had one or two pill formulas, they could only refine insignificant medicine pills. Thus, his original plan was based off of his master, Li Huiyuan, but since he had run into this martial senior Lei, Han Li immediately changed the target of his plan. No matter how one looked at it, this martial senior Lei was easier to manipulate than that master of his. This was not merely Han Li's intuition. Li Huiyuan was truly too stingy towards this in-name disciple of his. In addition, he was even more demanding and restricting because of their master-disciple relationship. Most likely, if today's methods had been used on Li Huiyuan, Han Li's master would only need to make an understatement and say, "Good filial piety," taking away these two spiritual medicines in a justified way. Han Li would have to act as if he had been moved to tears and thank his master for kindly accepting his offering. Now, with great difficulty, he had finally encountered another core formation cultivator, so naturally he wanted to seize this rare opportunity. You want to exchange medicinal formulas. This truly is a very tricky matter. Lei Wan's expression finally eased up after he seemingly thought of something. Then, his eyebrows became tightly knit, as if he were uncertain about it. Upon seeing this, Han Li did not feel disappointed. In fact, he began to yell, "There's a chance," in his heart. Otherwise, this martial senior Lei would not have this kind of an expression. As long as it's useful to this disciple, any pill formula is fine. Martial nephew won't make things difficult for Martial senior. Han Li hurriedly lowered his demands a notch. Martial nephew Han, Martial senior does have some pretty good pill formulas, but these things are all the foundational, secretly transmitted formulas that only my clan possesses. I truly cannot bring them out to exchange with you, Lei Wan said with regret, shaking his head. Han Li was incredibly disappointed after hearing this. He didn't attempt to cover up any of his emotions, so when the fatty noticed this, he began to laugh and said, "Although I cannot exchange my clan's pill formulas with you, I still have a few ancient formulas on hand. Some I found within historical ruins, while others I obtained by exchanging with friends. There'd be no problem if I were to exchange them with you." "Really? Then this disciple thanks Martial Senior," Han Li hurriedly thanked with joy. "Wait until I finish speaking, it's still too early to thank me," the fatty interjected disapprovingly, waving his hand. "Since we are going to make an exchange, as a Martial Senior, I need to make one thing clear," the fatty said seriously, causing Han Li to be startled slightly. "Please, Martial Senior, say it. This disciple will definitely listen to your teachings," Han Li immediately answered respectfully. "What do you mean listening to my teachings? I want to tell you the bad news first before you regret it in the future." Lei Wan glanced at Han Li and added indifferently, "If you follow these ancient formulas to refine medicinal pills, the result will all be genuine top-grade spiritual pills. But most importantly, the ingredients of these pill formulas are truly too difficult to find. I don't know if you will be able to obtain these items. Of course, although these ingredients are difficult to find, they definitely do exist in this realm. It's not the same as some other ancient formulas, where the ingredients have already gone extinct for an unknown number of years. In reality, many of the newly researched pill formulas are only the results of testing many ancient formulas with substitute ingredients. So, although the ingredients for refining pills are there, the pill's effectiveness decreased significantly. This is truly something that the cultivation world can do nothing about." The fatty's words shocked Han Li multiple times upon hearing them. However, he still understood the other person's meaning. Martial Senior's meaning is, "It's very easy. After you obtain the pill formulas, if you truly can't find all the ingredients to refine the pills, look for a substitute and try it out. Who knows, there might be a chance you'll succeed, the fatty solemnly said to Han Li. When Han Li heard this, he was speechless. However, he was clear in his heart that this Marshal Sr. probably felt that the ingredients for the pill formulas he was about to exchange for were truly too difficult to obtain. Most likely, he felt somewhat sorry. Thus, he gave Han Li a reminder. It seemed in this way that Marshal Sr. Lei's integrity was not too bad. Han Li secretly thought this, but he nonetheless put on a lovable outward appearance, repeatedly saying, "Okay," demonstrating that he was not considering backing out from the exchange. Seeing this, Lei Wan was extremely happy in his heart. He still felt that he had taken advantage of this martial nephew too much and felt somewhat sorry. After thinking for a moment, he spoke once again. "How about this? You have 2 spiritual herbs here. We'll exchange 1 herb for 1 formula. This Marshal Sr. can't let you take too much of a loss." When Han Li heard this, he stared blankly for a moment. However, immediately afterward he began to exult with joy, and his positive feeling for this Marshal Sr. Lei instantly increased greatly. He repeatedly thanked Lei Wan. This time, Han Li said it out of complete sincerity without any pretense. "Enough, this is the list of pill formulas. Pick 2. All of the medicinal pill attributes and the necessary ingredients are listed in there. When you have finished picking, I will give you the actual pill formulas." Saying this, the fatty pulled out a jade slip and tossed it towards Han Li. When Han Li excitedly received this item, he felt that something was strange. When had this Marshal Sr. prepared this catalog? But this question only flashed briefly in the back of his mind. Han Li received the jade slip, then very carefully scanned it, looking for any appropriate pill formulas. The spirit-gathering pill and this qi refining powder. Han Li retrieved his consciousness from the jade slip, then excitedly exclaimed, "Spirit-gathering pill, qi refining powder." The fatty indifferently nodded his head after hearing this and didn't say anything. He immediately pulled out 2 more jade slips from his storage pouch and tossed them out. "All right, it's no longer early. I should be heading back." The fatty happily stored the spiritual herbs on the table, then immediately said his goodbyes and left. Now that he had gathered all his ingredients, he hurried back to refine his own soul-strengthening pill. Upon hearing this, Han Li hurriedly stood up to escort him out. However, when Han Li was escorting him to the cave entrance, he suddenly remembered something. He then asked the other person about the whereabouts and cave location of his master, Li Hueyuan. When the fatty heard that Han Li was actually Li Hueyuan's in-name disciple, his shock was not small. However, he still told Han Li the location, then flew away on a streak of silver light. Han Li watched Lei Wan completely disappear before happily pulling out the jade slips with the pill formulas on them, playing around with them for a while. After a long time he turned around, wanting to return to his cave. However, Han Li had only taken 2 steps before an object near the cave attracted his attention. With a glance, it was actually Senior Marshal Brother Lin's body lying on the ground, curled up. It even preserved the posture of having been thrown out by the fatty. Han Li started for a moment, then walked towards it without hesitation. When he reached the corpse, he bent down and began to search. He remembered very clearly that Marshal Senior Lei had not touched anything on the corpse. He didn't know whether it was because he was too ashamed to do it in front of a junior like him, or if the items of a Foundation establishment disciple simply couldn't enter his eyes. As expected, Han Li found a storage pouch on the corpse's waist. This caused Han Li to begin to grin widely. After all, he was very interested in those puppets. The other person's storage pouch should have a huge pile of them. But when Han Li examined the storage pouch, the smile on his face gradually disappeared. The storage pouch actually did not have a single puppet inside of it. Apart from a few spirit stones and 2 bottles of regular medicinal pills, there was only an unassuming jade slip inside. This caused Han Li's fired-up mood to immediately be extinguished. He clearly controlled so many puppets that day. How could all of them have disappeared? Could they all have been destroyed? Han Li muttered to himself with an unhappy expression on his face. Han Li's guess was actually pretty much correct. On that day, Senior Marshal Brother Lin had controlled numerous puppets and was able to fight evenly with his opponents. However, when the quadruplets from the Thousand Bamboo Sect killed the 2 escaping cultivators, they hurried over to harass him. Senior Marshal Brother Lin, seeing that the circumstances were not good, immediately detonated all of his puppets. He then took advantage of the confusion and rushed out into the forest. Thus, not even a single mechanical puppet could be found in his storage pouch. In his disappointment, Han Li carelessly pulled out that jade slip. Then, as if it were routine, he sent his consciousness into it, then carelessly gave it a few cursory glances. All of a sudden, Han Li's eyes greatly widened, and the lazy expression on his face instantly froze. This was because as soon as his divine sense entered the Jade slip, 3 golden words emerged. Great development technique. Chapter 230, 7 Paying Respects. Chapter 237, Paying Respects. Great development technique. This was what Han Li had repeatedly heard of from senior martial brother Lin, the cultivation technique that the primordial soul tried to entice him with. He was actually able to rummage through his body as he wished and easily found it. This caused Han Li to feel ecstatic beyond belief. This great development technique had actually been carried on senior martial Lin's body. This truly went against his expectations. Han Li truly didn't know whether this senior martial brother Lin had been extremely stupid or extremely clever. He quickly skimmed through the Jade slip with the great development technique once through, and found that it was as senior martial Lin had said. There truly were only incantations up to the 4th layer. However, what appeared next caused Han Li to feel even more shocked. After he finished completely looking through the great development technique, a scripture called the True Puppet Insights appeared immediately afterward, completely instructing him on how to refine puppet beasts and soldiers of all grades. It was a very detailed and extraordinary puppet creation collection. After Han Li looked through it for a moment, he immediately withdrew his excited consciousness and wore an extremely happy expression. But after he looked at the Jade slip in his hand, he soon thought of something, and his expression suddenly became strange. The great development technique and the true puppet insights were a pair. If he simultaneously cultivated them, they would be flawless together. So long as he cultivated the both of them to a certain layer, he would surely be like Huang Long, a single person who relied on a great amount of puppets to remain unwavering against several cultivators of the same strength level, and didn't give them the slightest opportunity to resist. This kind of power that suppressed other Foundation establishment cultivators caused Han Li's heart to thump. However, he was very clear that there was a certain flaw. It was very possible that it would interfere with his own cultivation and cause his originally indistinct chances of core formation to be completely null. This was a matter where the gains did not make up for the losses. As for the odds that the great development technique could promote core formation, Han Li simply did not trust that kind of baseless nonsense. Han Li lowered his head and pondered for a moment. This was a very hard choice. He shook his head and first put away the Jade slip into his storage bag before deciding to deal with it in the future. After all, deciding whether to cultivate the great development technique along with the puppet creation technique that had dropped from the sky was a bit too sudden. This was a matter to be thought over after his heart calmed down. Regardless, this harvest had caused Han Li to be excited. He suddenly thought that, although the storage pouches of Huang Long and his fellow disciples had all been thoroughly decimated by Lei Wan's lightning attribute Sword Light, there were a few puppets that they had not retrieved in time still standing outside the formation. These were good items that would be a waste not to acquire. With this thought, Han Li left the great formation in a good mood. As expected, not far from the formation's outer boundary, he found many palm-sized puppet soldiers and mechanical beasts that had shrunk since nobody was controlling them. However, there weren't as many as Han Li had imagined, only about 20. The rest had been turned to ash by Lei Wang's sword light. But even if that was the case, Han Li collected them one by one while in high spirits. In one moment, he managed to sweep up so many good items. Han Li still wished to continue, wishing for hundreds of more puppet soldiers to appear before his eyes so he could gather them all. Han Li found this attitude of his to be laughable. This greed was truly insatiable. After a few words of self-mockery, Han Li returned to his immortals cave and prepared to study the ancient formulas. The next day he would go to where his master, Li Hueyuan, lived and see whether or not he could get some decent cultivation techniques. The morning of the next day, Han Li stood on his divine wind boat and flew straight toward the eastern part of the Tai Yue mountain range. Yesterday, Lei Wan had told him that his master's immortal's cave was located at the peak of a particular mountain. It also seemed that Li Hueyuan was busy with something inside his immortal's cave. If there was a moment to go find him, now was the time. With the speed of the divine wind boat, Han Li didn't have to spend much time to find the region that Lei Wan had pointed out. As expected, the location was well hidden by an azure mountain and green rivers. Han Li stood at the mountain peak above a huge waterfall and took out a sound transmission talisman from his bosom. He softly spoke a few words and then threw it out. The talisman then turned into a stream of fiery light, rushing toward the huge waterfall and disappearing from sight. After the time it took an incense stick to burn, the curtain of water separated, revealing a large cave. Then from within, a slim Confucian scholar who appeared over 30 years old flew out. When he saw Han Li, he immediately gave a warm greeting. "Are you junior martial disciple Han? This one is Master's eldest disciple, Yu Kun. You can call me senior martial brother Yu." After the Confucian scholar said this, he flew down with great ease, arriving by Han Li's side. He then looked at Han Li with a wide smile. "I pay respects to eldest senior martial brother." Han Li shouted this out of extremely caution. When this eldest senior martial brother Yu Kun saw Han Li's expression and his well-behaved greeting, his smile became even stronger. He said even more amiably, "Don't call me eldest senior martial brother. Eldest senior martial brother, that is far too formal. Just address me as senior martial brother Yu. I have already heard of junior martial brother's situation from Master." Junior martial brother Han was actually able to acquire such a large harvest from the trial by blood and fire. That truly was a remarkable feat. Yu Kun repeatedly praised him. Han Li played along with a few forced laughs. He didn't know why this person was so courteous to this unnamed disciple. It caused him to be quite uneasy. "I originally heard that junior martial disciple's aptitude wasn't very good, but now I see you have actually reached foundation establishment. This is truly a matter worthy of celebration." Yu Kun seemed to have been long aware that Han Li had reached foundation establishment. As a result, he hadn't expressed any surprise toward Han Li's success in entering foundation establishment. However, he still incessantly congratulated Han Li. This caused Han Li to become even more suspicious and vigilant. "That's right, Master is still waiting inside the cave for junior martial disciple. It's better to not let our elders wait for long. Let's first enter the Green Ripple Cave." It seemed Yu Kun had just thought of something. After he patted the back of his head, he said this with a chuckle. When Han Li saw the other party's expression, the corner of his mouth twitched, but his face maintained a solemn and respectful expression. He agreed at once and flew through the water curtain. After he passed through the water curtain, a small, naturally formed valley appeared before his eyes. Not only was it as beautiful as a spring day, but the trees were green and the water clear. Furthermore, there were a few remarkably strange small animals jumping about in an adorable manner. "This is," Han Li's mind tumbled, the scene before him. Could it be that his own master, a respected expert, was fond of raising small animals? The thought barged into Han Li's mind unexpectedly. What? Is junior martial brother surprised? You're not the only one who reacted this way. Every visitor that comes is astonished. However, these weren't raised by Master, but rather are the treasures of Master's wife. You mustn't harm them by any means, else the mistress will absolutely end you." Yu Kun chuckled, revealing an "I already knew you would be greatly surprised" expression. "Master's wife." That's right. Although Mistress Zan is only at mid-stage foundation establishment, the Master dotes on her very much. You must act good-natured and get along well with her." Yu Kun said this as he shrugged his shoulders. Yu Kun brought him further into the large cave, where much to Han Li's surprise, he saw not only his master Li Hueyuan, but also a young, beautiful, 27 or 28-year-old woman. Nothing needed to be said about his own master's ice-cold face, but when he saw Han Li, Li Hueyuan revealed a slight smile. Although Han Li thought the young woman was beautiful, how could he dare to look in front of Li Hueyuan? He only took a quick look and stepped forward, respectfully saluting. "Disciple Han Li greets Master." "You've come. This is your master's wife, greet her as well." Li Hueyuan was greatly satisfied with Han Li's respectful and solemn bearing and pointed to the young woman at his side. "Disciple pays respects to master's wife." Han Li inwardly sighed. He could only salute to this woman who didn't seem much older than himself. "That's enough, no need to be overly polite." When the young woman saw Han Li step forward to pay his respects, she said this with a smile. Her voice was soft and pleasant, displaying the sweet temper of a woman from a river village. As expected, she was an extremely dainty woman. "Han Li, I've only heard of the matter of your success into foundation establishment a few days ago. To tell the truth, this matter was rather hard for me to believe and amazed me by no small amount." Li Hueyuan said this with a smile and an incomparably gentle tone. This caused Han Li to truly feel overwhelmed by his superior's favor. This was disciple's fluke. Achieving foundation establishment also shocked this disciple. Han Li's face was slightly red, appearing as if he were embarrassed. Great luck also reflects one's own aptitude. Otherwise, wouldn't those born with outstanding aptitudes have even greater luck? Li Huayuan shook his head and said this with a smile. This. Not once did Han Li think he would feel so embarrassed and be rendered speechless. Chapter 238, Yu Kun's Fearsomeness. Chapter 238, Yu Kun's Fearsomeness. Humph, this fellow has only been a disciple for a short while. Don't use a lecturing tone immediately upon meeting him. The young woman said gently to Li Huayuan upon seeing Han Li's uncomfortable appearance, a trace of laughter in her eyes. Okay, husband knows. No matter what, this good disciple is also my wife's savior. As his master, I must compensate him well. Li Huayuan glanced at the young woman with a tender gaze, then turned around and said to Yu Kun, standing to the side. You can withdraw for now. Your master's wife and I are going to talk individually with your junior martial brother Han. Don't let anybody disturb us. As you command, master. Yu Kun respectfully replied, then stole an envious glance at Han Li before quietly withdrawing. Savior reward. Now Han Li was truly stunned. He really didn't know when these two words had suddenly become related to him. When had he earned a reward for saving someone, and how could he himself not know about it? Seeing Han Li's confused appearance, the young woman couldn't help but laugh and said, Lord husband, why don't you explain it to him? Your disciple doesn't know anything yet. Don't let his head be filled with fog. Hearing the young woman's words, Li Huayuan lightly smiled and explained to Han Li, nodding. Han Li, by now you should know the reason why I accepted you as my disciple back then. There's no embarrassment for me to talk about it. As your elder, I truly did covet your spiritual medicines. Thus, I used the excuse of receiving you as my disciple to take away a half of your portion. Otherwise, you should have received 2 foundation establishment pills, not just 1. However, although I confess that I caused your rewards to decrease for no apparent reason, you could have in turn also used my reputation to your advantage, and people wouldn't lightly offend you. This could be considered my way of making things up to you. After all, with regards to your natural talent back then, even if you were to have an extra foundation establishment pill, it seemed like your chances of successfully establishing your foundation were non-existent. Li Huayuan said, his expression nonchalant as if he did not feel that there was anything inappropriate about what he had done. But soon after, the situation changed. Not long after I obtained these spiritual medicines and was about to refine them into pills that could increase one's magic power, an accident suddenly occurred while my wife was cultivating, plunging her into danger. Luckily, I hadn't used your spiritual medicines yet, and thus I was able to temporarily preserve her life. In the few years afterward, I was able to use the remaining spiritual medicines to refine a pill that could save her, causing my wife to finally recover in the past few days. Because of this, when I told my wife about the origins of these spiritual medicines, my wife immediately expressed that I must reward you. After all, her life was preserved solely because of your spiritual medicines. You could also be considered her savior. When Li Huayuan talked about the young woman's life-threatening condition, his expression changed, as if he were reliving the dangerous circumstances of those times. It seemed as if he really dearly loved the young woman beside him. After I heard her say that, I felt that what she said was very reasonable, and so I wanted to officially accept you as my disciple before you reached the foundation establishment stage. But who knew that before I could make a move, I had already received the news that you had successfully established your foundation. This really surprised me. After all, I had previously said that as long as you entered the foundation establishment stage, I would officially accept you as my disciple. Thus, this could no longer be considered some kind of reward. I could only think of other ways within my abilities to reward you. Li Huayuan finally explained the whole situation once, causing Han Li to become somewhat dazed upon hearing it. He never expected that meat pies falling from the sky could actually land on his head. Even when he heard Li Huayuan personally say that he would reward him, Han Li still did not dare to believe it. Instead, he could only stand there stunned. What about this? Since it seems you haven't thought it through yet, you can think about it in your cave for a day. Tomorrow morning, you can come to your master and raise a request. You have to think about it carefully. Normally, your master is not a very generous person, so this is an opportunity that is hard to come by. The young woman gently said to Han Li, glancing at Li Huayuan. This caused Li Huayuan to dryly laugh a few times, as if he were somewhat embarrassed. Han Li, who finally regained consciousness, hesitated for a moment. Originally, he wanted to request a cultivation technique, but upon being reminded by his master's wife, he could not refuse the other person's good intentions, so he nodded his head and accepted. Then Li Hueyuan called Yu Kun to give Han Li a tour of the cave. This senior martial brother immediately agreed with a smile, then brought Han Li and walked out. They had not yet left the large lobby when he had already begun to introduce Han Li to the entire cave. Master, your green ripple cave is about a few hundred acres in size. As for rooms, the young woman, after seeing Han Li and Yu Kun walk far away, suddenly said to Li Hueyuan with a smile, "Do you think our new disciple can handle Yu Kun's harassment? Every time I see Yu Kun open his mouth, I feel a headache coming on even if he hasn't said anything yet. Yu Kun's long-windedness truly causes many headaches. Yi, not to mention you, even I have no way of dealing with him. Han Li definitely cannot endure for too long," Li Hueyuan said with helplessness. "This is also true, but what kind of request do you think this disciple of yours will make?" The young woman suddenly asked as she opened her round eyes. A trace of cunning could be found within them. What requests could he make besides pills, cultivation techniques, magic tools, and the sort? If it weren't for Madam's relentless requests to reward this disciple, I really would not be willing to be so generous. Li Hueyuan had not even handed anything out yet, but he already appeared to be in excruciating pain. "What are you talking about? If you don't repay his saving grace, the ice heart technique that I cultivate would contain many leaks, and I would not be able to cultivate it to the great circle of completion. Then, in the future, how could I enter the core formation stage and spend the rest of my life with you?" The young woman first gave Li Hueyuan a haughty look, but her next sentence was filled with deep affection, causing Li Hueyuan to feel greatly moved upon hearing it. He thumped his chest and expressed that he would definitely fulfill Han Li's requests and that he would not allow any troubles to be left in the way of his wife's cultivation. Han Li naturally did not know that the huge meat pie that fell on his head was actually related to the young woman's cultivation technique. At that moment, he was following senior martial brother Yu, wandering around, but in his heart, he still felt that the arrival of this kind of good fortune was too sudden. This caused him to feel strangely unsettled. "Yi, senior martial brother Yu has time to come to this sword discussion hall. How about us senior martial brothers exchange a few magic techniques?" When Yu Kun had brought Han Li near an extremely large stone room, an extremely buff man just so happened to be walking out of it. When he saw Yu Kun, he carelessly said this. However, his gaze was constantly sweeping over Han Li. "Who hasn't heard about the combat strength of 4th Junior Martial Brothers' 5 Elements magic technique? It is the #1 under Master's family. I think I'll pass and not make a fool of myself." Yu Kun's expression first changed upon hearing the man's words, then laughed and refused. However, he suddenly turned around and pointed at Han Li while laughing. "I still haven't introduced 4th Junior Martial Brother to this individual. He is the new disciple that Master is going to accept. He is the Junior Martial Brother Han, who is soon to become our 8th Junior Martial Brother. And this is your 4th Senior Martial Brother Song Meng. You can just call him Senior Martial Brother Song. Everyone come meet each other. After today, we will all be martial brothers from the same family. 8th Junior Martial Brother." When this 4th Junior Martial Brother heard these words, a radiant light shone out from his eyes, focusing directly on Han Li. Han Li's expression did not change, but in his heart, he quietly sighed. This individual was clearly a battle-crazy individual. Being gazed at him could not have any good outcomes. Thus, before this individual even opened his mouth, Han Li spoke first. "Greetings, 4th Senior Martial Brother. Junior Martial Brother has just recently entered the Foundation establishment stage. I ask that Senior Martial Brother take good care of me." Having said this, Han Li greeted him. However, these words from Han Li caused this man to reveal a disappointed expression. He lost interest in Han Li, and after indifferently nodding his head a few times, he didn't glance at Han Li even once. Then, he coldly walked directly between the two of them, leaving to attend to his own business. Only Han Li and Yu Kun remained, and they looked at each other in dismay for quite some time. "Haha, Junior Martial Brother Han, please don't take offense. Junior Martial Brother Song just has this kind of a strange temper. Although outwardly he appears somewhat cold, in actuality his personality is pretty good." It was still Yu Kun who recovered first, and with a few sentences he shook off the awkward atmosphere. Han Li naturally adopted an understanding attitude, and the two of them immediately continued on their way, laughing and talking. Although the cave was not small, apart from Li Huiyuan and his wife as well as that Song Ming, there were no other people in such a large place. Han Li did not encounter any of the other 5 senior martial brothers. Afterwards, Han Li learned that the other 5 were all like him and had their own caves outside. They would occasionally come to pay their respects to Li Huiyuan and his wife. As for Yu Kun and Song Ming, they had grown up next to Li Huiyuan and his wife. As such, they already had very deep feelings for them, so they naturally would stay in this place instead of building their own cave. As Han Li was idly chatting with Yu Kun, he finally gained some understanding of the other few cultivators. However, he had unwittingly finished touring the entire cave. This eldest senior martial brother's spirit seemed to rise the more he spoke, so he just pulled Han Li and began to walk towards his own room, wanting to continue their extended discussion. Although Han Li felt slightly surprised, he didn't mind, and so he indifferently followed him over. After all, this person was the eldest senior martial brother, so he still had to give him this face. In the beginning, he was intently listening to this eldest senior martial brother, hoping to find a few pieces of useful information. But not too long after, this senior martial brother's ability to chatter away was revealed to be truly frightening, and Han Li slowly began to experience it firsthand. The endless flow of words snuck into his head like evil spirits, causing Han Li's head to begin to hurt, having heard them for numerous hours. It wasn't until this moment that Han Li finally realized the truth. The attitude this eldest senior martial brother had shown when he had come to pick Han Li up was not enthusiasm. It was clearly that a hard-to-find guest had finally appeared to satisfy his addiction to flapping his lips. After another moment, Han Li could not longer take it, his physical fatigue finally growing too extreme. He hurriedly escaped from the other person's room, then found a room used to accommodate guests and collapsed. Hearing this senior martial brother use verbal attack was truly damaging to one's soul. Han Li had completely served this person's urges. Han Li's horizons had been broadened. This world actually contained men who could chatter like this. Chapter 239 Choice. Chapter 239 Choice. After a day in the Immortals' cave, Han Li stood in front of his master Li Huiyuan and his wife. He then heard his master indifferently say, "Han Li, have you finished thinking about what you want your master to give you? You can say it now." Disciple wants a cultivation art compatible with him. He hopes master can give 1 or 2 of them. This didn't need to be deeply thought about. Han Li, who had long known this answer, immediately blurted it out. When Li Huiyuan heard this, he didn't show any surprise and instead faintly smiled to his wife at the side. He seemed to be saying, "How about it? I wasn't wrong." He wanted a cultivation art as expected. Then he returned his gaze to Han Li and calmly said, Your choice isn't bad. First, let master examine your spiritual roots and then I will decide what cultivation art to give you." When Han Li heard this, he didn't dare to hesitate and immediately approached him. His master grabbed his wrist and quickly circulated energy around his meridians. Apart from metal cultivation techniques, all other attributes can be cultivated. You actually had 4 attribute spiritual roots, how shocking. On that day, I only saw that you had false spiritual roots, but I didn't think it'd be to such a degree. After a moment of examination, Li Huiyuan's expression grew slightly strange and he sighed. When the young woman at the side heard this, she also revealed an expression of slight surprise. She remained silent and could not help but size up Han Li. Disciple's aptitude is inferior and has disappointed master. Han Li's face was a bit red as he replied this with slight shame. This is nothing. Since the heavens have allowed you to reach foundation establishment, you surely have your own luck. But since it is like this, your choices for cultivation are a bit troublesome. What do you mean? When Han Li heard this, he blinked. Although Han Li did not take the initiative to ask, he displayed great doubt. Really? Give disciple a proper explanation. You are always so vague. Actually, what your master means was that he originally wanted to let you choose a decent cultivation art, but now that he has seen your spiritual root attributes, he's hesitant. After all, the better the cultivation art, the harder it is to cultivate. It would be better to let you cultivate a simpler cultivation art so that you advance a bit more quickly. The young woman rebuked Li Huiyuan and gave Han Li an explanation with a warm tone. That's right, my wife read my thoughts. Li Huiyuan repeatedly nodded his head. He then continued to explain. The cultivation arts of immortal cultivators can generally be classified into 3 main types in accordance with speed and effects. For the first time after it is cultivated, one's magic power progresses at a speed that is similar to that of inferior cultivation arts. However, it grants a supplementary divine ability that can suppress enemies and seize victory. Its power is likely to be outstanding and extremely suitable for combat. If one's magic power is at a lower layer, they will be able to, with slight difficulty, prevail against cultivators of a higher layer. Thus, cultivators who know they are unable to enter core formation most likely choose this type of cultivation art. The second type of cultivation technique is the exact opposite. These cultivation techniques progress one's magic powers at an astonishing rate and are easy to cultivate. But naturally, there is a flaw. The advantage of the first type of cultivation technique is precisely this type's fatal flaw. Furthermore, although those who cultivate the second type come across far fewer bottlenecks than those who use the first type of cultivation techniques, this kind of cultivation art has no powerful self-defense methods, and their divine abilities are pathetic. Those who choose this method are doomed to spend their life cultivating, and are the weaker among cultivators of the same grade. But similarly, they wish to cultivate to the highest layer in vain pursuit of the heavenly Tao. Those who choose this path are not few. After all, this is the easiest method to approach core formation. After Li Huayuan said this, he stopped for a moment and then looked at Han Li with a smile. What kind of magic technique does disciple wish to use? Perhaps there is a type between these two that fits you. When Han Li heard this, he paused for a moment and couldn't help but hesitate. He asked, "Master, were there not three kinds? Why have you only explained two?" When they both heard Han Li's question, the young woman gave a knowing smile. Li Huayuan faced Han Li and answered, "Apart from the first two types, there are the extraordinarily few cultivation arts that exist of the third type. Many cultivators pursue these top-grade cultivation arts. However, as your master, I do not recommend you cultivate these. Furthermore, none of your 7 senior martial brothers chose to cultivate these cultivation arts. Although they combine the several strong aspects of the first two type of cultivation arts, having both great power and astonishing magic progression, they have many restrictions. They are increasingly difficult as one progresses, and they are very dangerous to cultivate. If one is not careful, they will be beyond hope. Your master's wife cultivates such a top-grade cultivation art, but she was not careful and nearly died. Thus, if one cultivates these cultivation arts without transcendent aptitude, it would be a near equivalent to suicide. Although I have 2 or 3 of such top-grade cultivation arts, would you be able to succeed with them? Naturally, because I do owe you compensation. If you must choose these top-grade cultivation methods, Master will give them to you. However, if you encounter dangers or difficulties in the future, you will only be able to rely on yourself." Li Huayuan clearly did not approve of Han Li selecting these last types of cultivation arts, and warned Han Li in advance. Han Li wrinkled his brow and sunk his head in thought. This was a truly hard decision. But not long after, Han Li lifted his head with clear eyes. It was obvious that he made his decision. "Master, please forgive this disciple's rudeness. Disciple wishes to ask in advance, what cultivation art did Master cultivate?" Han Li suddenly asked. Your master cultivated the top-grade cultivation technique True Sun Arts. However, your master has a body only second to that of heavenly spiritual Poots, a 3-yang body. Cultivating this art suited me like a fish to water and was far superior to other cultivation arts. Otherwise, how could master form his golden core? Although Li Huayuan did not predict Han Li's question, he had still arrogantly replied. "Disciple understands. Then disciple will select the second type of magic techniques," Han Li said with a peaceful expression. "The second type." Li Huayuan's expression slightly changed, but after a second it returned to normal. Under the appearance of deep thought, he re-examined Han Li. When the young woman at the side heard this, she also wore a rather interested expression. "You chose the second choice, so how could Master say anything against this? If your cultivator's heart is resolute, then Master will truly be grateful. However, you should know the so-called easy refinement of magic power only applies to those with rather good aptitudes. Furthermore, even if they have outstanding aptitudes, only a few of them will be able to cultivate to the peak of foundation establishment. Thus, your master leans toward you choosing the first type of cultivation arts. With your prospects of achieving core formation so uncertain, at the very least, you'll be able to hold your head high among your fellow foundation establishment cultivators and accept no humiliation. In truth, regardless of what type of cultivation art is chosen, those who achieve core formation are few in number. Originally, Li Huayuan originally thought to give Han Li a few words of advice, but as he said this, he seemed to have recalled something. With his mood serious, he actually remained silent. When the young woman to the side saw this, she lightly sighed and said to Han Li, think of this well. What kind of cultivation art do you truly want? Although your choice does not match our thoughts, if your cultivator's heart is truly resolute, your master will naturally not oppose you. If you overestimate your own abilities and absolutely insist on choosing the top-grade magic techniques, although we as husband and wife will not object, we will be greatly troubled. After all, it would no longer be a question of the resolution of one's cultivator's heart, but rather that of biting off far more than one can chew. Correct, your master's wife has spoken your master's thoughts. Your master will not say more. I will only ask you once more, is that your final decision? Li Huiyuan's attention returned just as the young woman finished speaking, and he nodded his head in approval. Yes, disciple has firmly decided. After Han Li calmly listened to Li Huiyuan's wife's words, he replied with a deep tone. And since you've made up your mind, follow me to my library. Madame, please wait here. Han Li and I will return in a moment. When Li Huiyuan heard this, he said no more and stood up, bringing Han Li out and leaving the young woman to wait behind. The library room wasn't far away from the main hall and also wasn't very large. It was only a normal-looking short stone room. However, the stone room had a flaming barrier protecting it, denying entry to outsiders. Li Huiyuan stood in front of the barrier. Without care, he extended his finger toward the surface of the barrier and casually swiped, causing the barrier to immediately open a 3-meter gap, just enough for 2 people to enter through. He then easily pushed open the stone door and let Han Li in. After Han Li entered, his eyes greatly widened. Inside the room, all sorts of jade slips, book pages, boxes, and collections were suspended in midair, displaying strange lights of all colors. There were more than 60 items. They were Li Huiyuan's collection of cultivation techniques that he had gathered over several hundred years. All the items here are under my restrictions. If someone aside from me or my wife personally reaches within, the formation spell within the stone room will immediately activate, and they will be completely trapped inside. Li Huiyuan explained to Han Li with satisfaction. However, Han Li heard the trace of warning within those words, so he repeatedly nodded his head, expressing his understanding. Chapter 240, Pages of a Book. Seeing that Han Li was quite discreet, Li Huiyuan revealed an expression of satisfaction. Then, he reached his hand out in midair and gently grabbed at something. Instantly, a red streak of cloud flew out from his hand, wrapped around a jade slip and brought it back to his hand. Li Huiyuan didn't even glance at it and directly handed it to Han Li. Then, he used the same method to grab 7 or 8 items in a row before halting. At this time, Han Li was already holding a huge pile of items, too many for his eyes to take in. These cultivation techniques can all progress one's magic power quickly, and they are also easy to cultivate. Pick one to use as your main cultivation technique. You have to put the other ones back in their original position. When you have finished picking one out, come tell me, Li Huiyuan said to Han Li indifferently. Then, he sat down cross-legged on a prayer mat in the stone room. Han Li felt that his eyes were seeing stars. Although there weren't many cultivation techniques, they all had their own unique attributes. For example, one of them, the essence-gathering technique, apart from having a decent speed in increasing one's magic power, also had the essence-gathering spirit armor, an incredibly practical minor divine ability. When facing an enemy, in addition to the protection of a defensive magic technique, one could condense one's magic power into spirit armor as an additional layer of protection. It could serve as a life-saving technique, and the spirit armor's defense could also slowly increase as one progressed in the essence-gathering technique. Another jade slip recorded the just as impressive Mirage Spirit Art, which also included the Mirage Shadow ability. One could produce an avatar exactly like oneself at any time to confuse enemies. The higher one's cultivating layer was, the more avatars one could produce, which would confuse enemies even more. Apart from these 2 kinds of cultivation techniques, the other cultivation techniques included small abilities that were extremely suited for escaping despite not being too powerful. It seemed as if the creators of these cultivation techniques were also very clear that these cultivation techniques would not allow individuals to fight fiercely against others. Instead, it was more important to flee with one's small life. However, after Han Li had browsed through all of them once, a golden page inside a jade box jolted Han Li awake. That was because this page's script and size were too familiar. Han Li confirmed that it was identical to the silver page that he himself possessed. The only difference was that this page seemed to be thinner, and its surface did not have those strange patterns. Instead, it was covered with densely packed ancient writings. But when he took a closer look, the technique that was recorded was a common magic technique, the essence concentration technique. Its ability was also an extremely average support technique called the spirit gathering technique, and could only increase the speed at which spiritual chi was gathered. TL, the silver page first appeared in chapter 213. Han Li studied the golden page numerous times, but doing so only increased the uncertainty in his heart. However, he also knew that even though he had a strong urge to pull out the silver page in his storage pouch and compare the two of them, now was not the time to solve this mystery. Regardless, he had to make a decision now, otherwise he would arouse his master's suspicions. With this in mind, Han Li hefted this golden page in his hand and made his decision. As such, he opened his mouth and said to Li Huiyuan, who was resting with his eyes closed, "Master, I have made a decision. I choose this cultivation technique." When Li Huiyuan heard this, he opened his eyes. Seeing the golden page in his hand, he was slightly startled, but he didn't say anything. He simply nodded his head and brought him out of the stone room. The young woman had been waiting for the master-disciple pair. When she saw them return, she smiled warmly before asking, "How is it, did you make a decision?" "Many thanks for Madame's concern. This disciple has already made a selection," Han Li respectfully answered. "Then I can be at peace." Hearing this, the young woman smiled happily again. It was as if she cared even more about this matter than Han Li did, which surprised him. "All right, since you have been repaid for saving my wife, let us talk about the matter of officially accepting you under my guidance. Are you genuinely willing to enter my tutelage and officially become my disciple?" Li Huiyuan suddenly asked, his expression thickening. Han Li's heart trembled, and he hurriedly stepped forth, knelt, and said, "Disciple, Han Li's heart is genuine. I do not dare to have even a trace of pretense." Although Han Li spoke in this way, in actuality he began to mutter in his heart, "If you genuinely take care of me, I will naturally be 100% sincere and willingly be your disciple until the very end. However, if you have any bad intentions, I will not be so silly as to be manipulated by you." Li Huiyuan naturally did not know the thoughts in Han Li's heart. Otherwise, he would have exterminated Han Li with one hand a long time ago. "Right, us cultivators are simple people. From today onwards, you are Li Huiyuan's official disciple. I hope that you'll diligently cultivate in the future so that my reputation doesn't wane." Li Huiyuan lightly smiled with a warm expression. Han Li and Li Huiyuan fulfilled the roles of a filial disciple and a compassionate master for a while. But soon after receiving Li Huiyuan's instructions, Han Li bid farewell and left. As he was leaving the cave, he happened to run into that eldest martial brother Yu. In the end, this individual insisted on sending his junior martial brother out. However, how could Han Li, who had just yesterday experienced firsthand the devilish, unceasing chattering, inflict such pain upon himself? He declined profusely on the spot. In the end, the other person left with a regretful expression, and Han Li was able to escape the entanglement. As Han Li stood upon the small boat, he couldn't help but think about all that had happened in the past 2 days. His impression of his master, Li Huiyuan, was much better than it had been before, especially since his master's attitude sharply differed from the indifference he showed during the expedition to the forbidden area. He didn't know if it was because he had saved his master's wife, or because he had successfully established his foundation. But now, he was finally being viewed with importance by this core formation cultivator. Regardless, Han Li finally felt that this trip had not been in vain. Not only did he obtain a large backer in the cultivation world, he also obtained that golden page. Now, he could hope to reveal the secrets hidden in the silver page. Even if he had no way of unraveling its mysteries, Han Li did not mind. At the very last, he would cultivate the essence concentration technique. Although this cultivation technique didn't have any great effects, Han Li had other ways of protecting himself, so he did not worry about this matter. When he returned to his own cave, Han Li immediately went into his own room and hurriedly pulled out the gold and silver pages from his storage pouch, carefully comparing the two. The silver page was still the same as the last time he studied it. Han Li placed both the silver page and the gold page in front of his eyes and superimposed the two. As expected, they were identical in size. With one glance, one could tell that they were closely linked. Han Li took these 2 pages, one on the left and one on the right, weighing them individually in each hand. He judged that the silver page was slightly heavier. It seemed as if his speculation that the golden page was somewhat thinner was not incorrect. Their thickness was truly different. Han Li tilted his head and thought for a moment. Suddenly, He took only the silver page and raised it to his eye, carefully scrutinizing the strange patterns on it and stroking it with his hand incessantly. At this time, his eyes twinkled indefinitely, as if there was a very difficult problem ahead of him that he could not make a decision about. However, an unwavering expression still appeared on Han Li's face. He suddenly placed the page between his two hands, then he gently rubbed his hands together. Instantly, the silver page was enveloped in a fierce flame, casting a red glow onto Han Li's face. However, he did not care at all, instead staring at the page in the flames without blinking. At this time, the surface of the page was beginning to melt due to high temperatures. Suddenly, Han Li's expression changed, and then an expression of joy surfaced on his face because the silver page, now with its surface layer melted, actually revealed a golden light. Sure enough, the page contained a secret. Seeing this situation, Han Li carefully controlled the flames, not allowing the golden layer to also be damaged. However, Han Li clearly was overly worried. The newly revealed golden page seemingly didn't fear being roasted by the fierce flames and didn't warp at all. When a brand new golden page was completely revealed, Han Li waved his hand, and the flames immediately disappeared. Then, he began to read the newly obtained page, his heart beating like crazy. He only read the first few words before he froze, stunned. His expression instantly became extremely unsightly. That was because this page was actually a manual written to teach people how to control flying swords and was specifically geared towards those who cultivate sword arts. Although it appeared to be extremely remarkable, it was something that Han Li simply did not need. It seemed as if that barefooted man from the giant sword sect had cultivated the page's contents. However, though these techniques may have been considered treasures to Qi condensation disciples, to Han Li, who had reached the great success stage of foundation establishment, they were only average and simply had no way of piquing his interest. Han Li was still unwilling to give up. He closely examined it one more time, even going so far as to use the fierce flames to burn it again, but he made no further discoveries. The more Han Li looked at this golden page, the more he felt resentful. He had busied himself with this for the greater half of the day. Having wasted so much time, he actually obtained such a useless item. How could he not feel extremely depressed? Han Li was especially provoked upon seeing the two words sword art, because he had already cultivated an azure essence sword art. Could it be that he would have to cultivate yet another sword art? The gloomy-faced Han Li suddenly grabbed the page and threw it into midair. Immediately afterward, he used his right hand and pointed, shooting out an azure sword edge as wide as a bowl, directly hitting the page. Han Li decided to completely destroy this thing, lest he become angry just from looking at it. Whoosh! The explosion that Han Li had expected did not appear. Instead, the azure sword streak disappeared into page upon contact as if it had been absorbed. Han Li was very shocked, but immediately after his heart stirred with anticipation. Chapter 241, 3 Essence Revolutions Technique. He raised his hand and cast a floating technique on the golden page that had fallen in his hand, causing it to float many feet in the air, acting as a target. He then began to use small bursts of azure essence sword streaks to attack it bit by bit, eagerly gazing at the page, which seemed to absorb all of the sword streaks like a bottomless pit. While doing this, Han Li had also tried to shoot an ice arrow towards it to see if that magic spell could also be absorbed. In the end, one arrow caused the page to go flying, ending Han Li's experiences with a fright. Instead, he obediently continued to shoot sword streaks into it. Han Li's azure essence sword streaks of the fourth layer should have been quite powerful, but the page had yet to respond as he was on the edge of exhaustion. Han Li bitterly complained as a result. He truly did not know whether or not all his hard work would go to waste if he didn't satisfy this page's absorption of sword streaks all in one go. Just as Han Li was conflicted about whether to proceed or stop, the page finally began to change, and the golden light on the page's surface exploded out. The page was no longer able to absorb the sword streaks. Instead, it began to reflect them, carving quite a few holes in the walls of the cave. Han Li repressed the excitement in his heart, and he watched the page's transformation without blinking at all. The light on the page slowly began to retreat and converged into words of light as large as ants. The page soon became densely dotted with golden light, like the stars in the sky, causing Han Li to feel great shock. Then with a patter, the floating spell suddenly lost its effectiveness, and the golden page fell straight to the ground. Han Li, still in shock, instinctively and immediately stretched out and grabbed the golden page. But just when Han Li's fingers made contact with this item, it was as if the words of light had found an outlet and rushed in through that hand, fiercely channeling themselves throughout his entire body. Han Li was greatly shocked, and the color drained from his face. He hurriedly wanted to toss aside the page, but the page forcibly stuck itself onto Han Li's hand as if it were alive. Han Li was unable to shake it off despite his best efforts. The transmission of the words of light was just too fast. In an instant, all of the words of light had crawled all over Han Li. Glistening words of light covered Han Li's body from head to toe, appearing incomparably strange. Han Li was helpless and scared witless. Suddenly, the words of light appeared to have received a command and flocked toward his head. The countless words seeped into his brain in an instant, but because of the sudden rush, Han Li immediately held his head while screaming in pain. If the current circumstances continued for even a bit longer, Han Li's brain would most likely violently burst. Fortunately, the pain only lasted a short moment before the words of light all finished entering his head. Han Li then weakly fell to the ground and was unable to move in the slightest. After no less than the quarter of an hour, Han Li regained some of his spirit and was finally barely able to stand. Although the pain inside his head had greatly alleviated, buzzing still lingered, and his nerves were stretched thin. Han Li hurriedly climbed into the stone bed, closed his eyes, and regulated his breathing, allowing his mind to completely relax. Han Li meditated like that for 3 days and 3 nights. Not only did all feeling of discomfort disappear from his head, but he also figured out the reason behind the overflow of words of light. Azure Essence Sword Art. Furthermore, it was the complete magic art, all 13 layers without any gaps or lost sections. It could even be cultivated all the way until the legendary deity transformation stage without question. These were the words that were brought forth from the words of light. Just as Han Li started to receive this information, he was faintly shocked, but his face didn't show a shred of happiness. This was because of the supplementary cultivation technique at the very end, the 3 essence revolutions technique. At first, this piqued Han Li's interest, so he looked through it as he wished. After browsing the first few passages, he blankly stared for a moment. He believed that he had misunderstood, but after he read through that part several more times, he was convinced that he was not mistaken, causing Han Li to enter a state of raging ecstasy. This 3 essence revolutions technique actually possessed the miraculous, heaven-shaking effect of evading the core formation stage bottleneck. This information seemed like a voice from the heavens, causing Han Li to believe that it was a dream. Ever since he entered the world of cultivation, nearly every cultivator had talked about the problems of core formation. Everyone had sighed and shook their heads. All have said that breaking through to core formation was basically reliant on one's luck. It was a matter completely decided by the heavens. Naturally, those with excellent aptitude had already cultivated to the peak of foundation establishment and possessed the qualifications for core formation. In addition, those possessing heavenly spiritual roots, naturally, did not have any problems in this area. To be blunt, Han Li's confidence in achieving core formation was almost nil. With great difficulty, he spent all his life trying to find a way, so at this point, he was truly reluctant to give up. But despite this, Han Li was unwilling to so passively renounce the pursuit of eternal life merely because it was difficult. Even as hopeless as it was, his thirst for core formation and his will to struggle only grew stronger. But now, a straight path to core formation appeared before him, allowing him to bypass the bottleneck. How could Han Li not be in ecstasy? But regardless of Han Li's excitement, this cultivation art couldn't be considered a shortcut. In fact, it was completely unverified. The expert who created this cultivation technique and the Azure Essence Sword art had long since reached core formation when he created these techniques, which he based on an insane idea about core formation. He stated at the very end of the cultivation technique that even if one completely followed the cultivation technique and fulfilled all that was required, the odds of immediate formation of a core was only 1/2. However, this was enough for Han Li. Even if one were to say only 1 in 10 instead of 1 in 2 odds, it would be enough for Han Li to pursue it without hesitation. But after Han Li's moment of ecstasy, he carefully analyzed the cultivation technique, and what he found decimated his hopes. Even if Han Li were a person with strong aspirations, he could not help but appear to have taken a direct blow, his face increasingly pale. Those cultivating the 3 Essence Revolutions technique obviously needed to first cultivate the Azure Essence Sword art, since this technique was originally founded on its basis. Although the Azure Essence Sword art was extraordinarily difficult to practice, that was not the most important point. What caused Han Li's face to become unsightly was due to the meaning behind the technique's name. The individual must first cultivate to the 6th layer of the Azure Essence sword art, then disperse their sword art cultivation, after which they must cultivate all over again. According to its founder, only like this would someone be able to use the 3 Essence Revolutions technique. By repeating cultivating his magic power, his true essence would able to further compress and have his magic power become several times more pure. After doing this 3 times in succession and cultivating back to the peak of foundation establishment, he would be able to form a core in his dantian with ease. According to this expert's conjectures, a gold core was originally created by solidifying one's true essence and condensing it. If the true essence was already solidified, forming a core would naturally be effortless. Even if Han Li felt that what this expert said was reasonable, he was truly hesitant to foolishly disperse his own cultivation. This wasn't because Han Li was scared of the hardship of regaining his lost cultivation, but rather because he wasn't confident that he would be able to cultivate 3 times within his lifespan. Even if he had the assistance of the small, mysterious bottle, this was a matter of extreme risk. After all, according to the expert's plan, it would take longer and longer to cultivate as he would need to condense and compress his true essence more each time. The great benefits of doing this were, without a doubt, extremely great. It would allow him to have true essence and magic power several times greater than that of common cultivators, but at the same time, he would certainly be required to spend more time than common cultivators. With a trifling 200 years of life, would he be able to do all of this? Han Li truly did not know. After a moment of indecision, Han Li looked toward the golden page that he received from Li Hueyuan. Only after an inspection of what it contained would he be able to come to a decision. As a result, an equivalent sword stream entered the gold page and was rewarded with an equivalent headache. Han Li experienced it once more, accepting the contents of the other gold page. Azure Bamboo Cloudswarm Sword. This was what entered in Han Li's mind. Han Li became extremely interested and patiently arranged the words of light before poring through it. It turned out that inside the gold page were actually instructions for how to refine a core formation flying sword magic treasure called Azure Bamboo Cloudswarm Sword. This wood attribute flying sword was actually quite similar to Han Li's gold beetle swarm blades, as it was refined as a set of magic treasures. At least 12 wood attribute flying swords were required to form a set. It was quite strange. Naturally, if he were able to collect enough materials and had enough true essence, he could theoretically refine 36 or even 72 as a set. Chapter 242, Making Talismans. Chapter 242, Making Talismans. Han Li carefully put away for the 2 golden book pages and planned his future actions meticulously. Since he wanted to cultivate the 3 Essence Revolutions technique, the small, mysterious bottle's green liquid must be used to its full extent. Thus, he quickly gathered together the materials for the 2 ancient formulas. If it could be bought, it was bought. He let nothing slip away. With this said, apart from spiritual power, the green liquid also had other components, but they still remained a complete mystery to him. There was no way that spiritual chi by itself was able to miraculously mature plants. After entering Yellow Maple Valley, he had researched it several times. Regardless of how diluted the spiritual liquid was, with just a tiny drop of green liquid mixed with water, all the animals that tasted it had similarly exploded. It wasn't a matter of how diluted the green liquid was, but rather its unknown components running rampant. After receiving several similar results, Han Li was forced to begrudgingly give up. But using the mysterious small bottle to simply refine pills was a bit narrow. Han Li felt that using its wondrous effects to mature plants had many more uses. To use it just for pills seemed wasteful. After a moment of consideration, Han Li felt that with foundation establishment battles, apart from magic tools and cultivation techniques, mid-grade or higher talismans were an absolute necessity. However, these mid-grade talismans were extremely expensive. A single talisman often cost several tens of spirit stones. Han Li could only shake his head repeatedly. A good number of these mid or higher grade 5 elements talismans had truly great power. They could take the place of incisive Taoist magics, capable of saving one's life. If a magic technique's grade was too high, then even if a foundation establishment cultivator were to use it, it would require no small amount of magic power and time. As such, purchasing a few of these talismans was essential as a life-preserving last resort. Thus, Han Li decided to refine talismans actual mid-grade talismans. Because refining talismans required blank talisman paper refined from spirit herbs of a certain maturity, Han Li wanted to bring out the bottle and make full use of its wondrous effects. Naturally, high-grade talismans couldn't be made with this method. Those required spirit hides of a few particular demonic beasts, and Han Li was currently not capable of acquiring such hides. As for the cinnabar used to refine talismans, there was no need to be picky since most of the supply was refined from the blood of a few spirit beast species, the majority being extracted from domesticated spirit beasts. It fundamentally wasn't worth much. One had to be somewhat selective with the talisman brushes used to make talismans. However, Han Li already had the golden sincerity brush, which should suit his needs. When Han Li thought of the golden sincerity brush, he naturally thought of that young, easily embarrassed Han Yunjai and couldn't help but slightly smile. At this moment, she was probably at Spirit Beast Mountain. But in the blink of an eye, Han Li regained his focus and once again pondered about the feasibility and risks of refining talismans. He had the tools and an unending supply of materials. The fundamental problem of a talisman refinement expert, having enough materials, was no problem for him. Currently, the only restriction he had was his cultivation of mid-grade and higher Taoist magics. Talisman refinement experts must first be able to use a magic technique before refining it onto a talisman. Otherwise, there would be nothing to inscribe onto the talisman paper. After all, talismans were only a method of sealing a magic technique in advance. When he thought of having to cultivate mid-grade magic techniques, Han Li felt a pounding headache. He didn't know whether it had to do with his spiritual roots, but when he practiced Taoist magics of the 5 elements, he felt that his talent was extremely lacking. Even after spending several times more effort and time than other cultivators, he wouldn't make the slightest of gains and remained completely ignorant of the magic's essence. However, after he entered Foundation Establishment, he was able to easily learn those few elementary magic techniques. Furthermore, he was proficient enough to perform most of them in the blink of an eye, but for mid-grade magic techniques, it was the same as before. He could only look up to the sky and sigh. Han Li knew that if he arduously cultivated a few mid-grade magic techniques, he would most likely be able to seal and imprint a few talismans. He had no extravagant hopes of being able to refine all of the mid-grade magic techniques he wished. With a great amount of mid-grade talismans, not only would he have a great advantage in battle, but he could also sell them openly without arousing the suspicion of others. Thus, Han Li was freed from the plight of lacking spiritual stones. He currently didn't dare to conspicuously take out spiritual herbs to trade for spirit stones. Furthermore, Han Li had further thoughts. If his cultivation truly scattered and he had to cultivate back what he lost, during that time, he would unquestionably be at his weakest. If an enemy or someone with a grudge found him, how wouldn't he be in great danger? After all, the world of cultivation wasn't some peaceful world. Anything could happen. But if he had a lot of talismans on hand, he would be able to preserve a certain amount of strength. Even if he couldn't subdue an enemy with the assistance of talismans, he could most likely escape with them. Although learning how to refine talismans would surely interfere with the advancement of his magic power, regardless of how he saw it, it would only take up some of his time. The gains were greater than the losses. After Han Li tossed and turned several times in his chambers, he decided to simultaneously cultivate the Azure Essence sword art and practice talisman refinement. Having made his decision after much deliberation, Han Li immediately set into motion. During the next few days, he made 2 trips to his own sect's market city, as well as the Heavenly Star sect's market city, to look for seeds and sprouts of spiritual herbs used in talisman paper refinement. The materials written in the ancient pill formulas were naturally extremely rare and priceless materials. Fortunately, Han Li didn't have any problems with the maturity of these medicinal herbs and was fortunate enough to gather enough materials for the qi refining powder, causing him to be overjoyed. As for the materials for the talisman paper, because he was starting with low-grade talismans, they were easily required. Of course, a large amount of cinnabar was indispensable. After 3 or 4 days, Han Li created an opening in his great formation outside his immortal's cave and entered it, closing it behind him. Then he entered secluded cultivation for his first time after reaching Foundation Establishment. Time does not stop for cultivation. 4 years passed in the blink of an eye. Underneath the concealment of the formation spell, the cave's entrance had been tightly closed since that day and hadn't been opened since. Then one day, a blue streak of light suddenly flew from the distant horizon. After it circled several times around the great formation, it turned into a chuckling Confucian scholar holding a blue wooden board in his hand. "So this is young Junior Marshall Brothers' Immortals Cave. Why did you pick such a remote place? Furthermore, the spiritual chi also isn't very abundant. If Marshall Senior Lay hadn't given me a few directions, it would have truly been hard to find." The Confucian scholar muttered to himself with an expression of surprise. Soon after, the Confucian scholar sized up the great formation outside the Immortals Cave, suddenly displaying a desire to test it out. Marshall Senior Lay said this young Junior Marshall Brothers' great defensive formation was incomparably ferocious, and that if a core formation cultivator were to come, they wouldn't necessarily be able to break through. This must truly be false. How could it possibly be so ferocious? Should I give it a try? But after a bit of consideration, the Confucian scholar dejectedly hung his head and said to himself, "Forget about it. This will interfere with Master's plans." With that said, he took out a sound transmission talisman and looked at Han Li's great formation. The sound transmission talisman suddenly turned into a streak of fiery light and silently entered the formation. Then the Confucian scholar immediately threw the wooden board in his hand into the air and left, flying away on his flying magic tool. At this moment, in the secluded room with the spirit wellspring, Han Li was meditating with his eyes closed. His appearance was actually exactly the same as 4 years ago, without the slightest of change. However, his body was enveloped in a layer of faint azure light that continuously flickered, appearing as if it were an exceptionally beautiful illusion. But if someone were to look it around, they would be beyond speechless. That was because there were talismans of all grades scattered around Han Li, from the elementary low-grade fireball and ice arrow techniques to the elementary high-grade techniques, earth wall and fire cloud and more. It seemed as if this were a large storehouse for talismans. In addition, there were a few empty boxes of cinnabar as well as stacks of blank talisman paper scattered about, appearing extremely messy. Not knowing how much time had passed, Han Li wrinkled his brow in response to something and opened his eyes. After a moment of thought, he suddenly stood and walked out of the seclusion chamber. As soon as he stood, all of the talismans and other items on the floor silently entered his storage pouch. His room instantly became spotless. As he walked out of the seclusion chamber, Han Li waved his hand, and a small yellow flag appeared in it. Then he threw it out, turning the small flag into a streak of yellow light that flew outwards. Before Han Li could finish walking to his bedroom, the small flag that had turned into a yellow light returned with a streak of fiery light in tow. When Han Li saw this, he calmly moved his hand and summoned the small flag into it. He opened his other hand and shot out azure light toward the fiery light before him. Chapter 243, Medical Efficacy. Chapter 243, Medicinal Efficacy. Han Li flicked his finger, and the streak of azure light flew into the flame. With a bang, the flames shot up a few feet, and Li Hueyuan's voice suddenly came out of it clearly. "Immediately come to Green Ripple Cave. Your master has something to talk to you about." After these words, that streak of flame light immediately exploded into a shower of sparks that filled the sky, dissipating without a trace. After Han Li heard the message, he rubbed his nose and entered his own room, his expression calm. Upon entering his room, Han Li pulled out a small wooden trunk from underneath the stone bed. The trunk contained 10 or so different styles of storage pouches. Han Li pulled out the one that he was currently carrying, then dumped out the large pile that had been stored inside the trunk. Then, he divided them individually by type and quality, placing them into different locations. Next, Han Li shoved the trunk back into its original place, hesitated for a brief moment, then headed directly for the main entrance to the cave. Standing on the divine wind boat, Han Li began to recall the circumstances of his cultivation and talisman manufacturing during these past 4 years, his expression somewhat heavy. When Han Li sealed his cave, he had set up a small, very well-hidden medicinal garden in his cave. Although it wasn't large, it was enough for him to nurture his medicinal herbs while cultivating. The benefits of doing it this way were that, when he was behind closed doors, he wouldn't have to worry about the medicinal herbs he was ripening being discovered. There would be no need for him to leave his cave, and he could be completely self-sufficient. For this, he had purposefully opened countless small hidden holes in the rock wall near the medicinal garden to allow sunlight to enter, which the little bottle could use to absorb spiritual chi. Of course, the locations of these small holes were all definitely in the effective range of the Great Formation, so he didn't need to be concerned about others finding it. As for the large medicinal garden outside, Han Li naturally planned to use it as a protective decoy. With the small medicinal garden, Han Li could assuredly ripen his spiritual medicines while refining medicinal pills using innate true fire. Although true fire was somewhat worse than earth fire, it was superior in its stability and safety. In addition, Han Li wouldn't have to worry about the number of times that he failed to refine them. The medicinal pills refined from the ancient recipes were, as expected, no small matter. After Han Li had refined the qi refining powder and consumed it, he experienced afresh the kind of explosion of spiritual qi that he had felt when establishing his foundation, causing him to immediately sit down in shock and begin to refine it, not daring to have the slightest amount of neglect. This shocking outcome naturally caused his magic power within the first year of closed-door cultivation to vigorously shoot up, far outstripping any of his expectations. Extravagantly ingesting medicine saved Han Li the time he would have spent on absorbing spiritual qi and allowed him to throw himself directly into refining it into magic power. His efficiency in increasing his magic power naturally multiplied many times. This caused Han Li to be unable to contain his joy. Recultivating the Azure Essence Sword art 3 times suddenly became a very realizable prospect. Although the Azure Essence Sword art truly did strangely cause a portion of one's magic power to dissipate every few days just like how he had been told, with 1 pouch of qi refining powder every 6 or 7 days, this defect could be completely overlooked. During this time, Han Li also ingested a foundation establishment pill out of curiosity. In the end, its effect was minimal, so Han Li completely gave up on this train of thought. However, in the latter 3 years, a matter that greatly surprised Han Li occurred. Starting from the 2nd year, the surge of spiritual qi when ingesting the qi refining powder gradually decreased year after year until the 4th year, when the same thing that had happened to the yellow dragon pellet and the golden essence pill back then happened once again. The qi refining powder lost all of its effectiveness. No matter how many pouches Han Li ingested, he could not feel any spiritual qi. Han Li's head hurt, and he also began to feel greatly distressed. That was because this was definitely not because the qi refining powder was insufficient to keep up with his rate of growth. Based on this qi refining powder's medicinal properties, using it all the way to the late stages of foundation establishment should not have posed any problems. After all, it was a pill based on the ancient formula. Even for core formation cultivators, it might be quite useful. The circumstances were completely different than with the yellow dragon pellet and golden essence pill. Those pills couldn't keep up with his cultivation layers, and he had anticipated their failures a long time ago. After musing over it hundreds of times, Han Li used the medical arts that he had learned before to draw a conclusion. Perhaps he had used the overly powerful qi refining powder too frequently, finally causing his body to generate a natural resistance to its medicinal properties. Thus, this kind of medicinal pill gradually lost its efficacy for him. Han Li was unable to determine the veracity of this conclusion. After all, in the cultivation world, no one else was able to extravagantly consume medicinal pills every few days. Naturally, he had no precedent to compare to, nor could he borrow someone else's experiences. However, Han Li still hoped that if he stopped using this medicinal pill for a certain period of time, the qi refining powder would regain its effectiveness. Holding on to this kind of thinking, Han Li stopped using medicinal pills in the remaining year, switching over to conventional methods to cultivate the Azure Essence Sword art. However, having become accustomed to the speed of magic power increase when taking spiritual medicines, it was very difficult for him to endure the slow speeds of obediently cultivating using conventional methods. Even more so, using this method to cultivate based on his natural talent, it would be a miracle if he could cultivate it once in his lifetime, let alone 3 times. After enduring a year of cultivating at the speed of a turtle, the results still brought Han Li great disappointment. Upon ingesting the qi refining powder again, it still had no effect. It seemed as if this medicinal pill had completely lost its effectiveness. He could only search for other spiritual medicines. As a result, even if Li Hueyuan had not used a sound transmission talisman to call him, Han Li had already decided to take a trip outside his cave. After all, he still possessed another ancient recipe for which he had not yet prepared raw ingredients for. Only by refining this kind of spiritual pill could his magic power vigorously shoot up again. In addition, he planned on searching for a few more pill recipes. If the spirit gathering pill also lost its effectiveness like the qi refining powder, Han Li could only resort to taking another kind of pill every few years. As for refining talismans, the process went extremely smoothly. Every day, he would set aside the first half of a day, starting by practicing low-grade magic techniques that he could already perform, not treasuring the raw materials and crazily refining talismans non-stop. This kind of wasteful method, which other talisman refinement masters could not even conceive of, caused Han Li's skill in talisman refinement to rise continuously. Now, he could just barely refine elementary high-grade talismans, even though his success rates were still pitifully low. He had already decided that the next time he cultivated behind closed doors, he would begin to practice refining mid-tier magic spells and attempt to refine mid-grade talismans. These were his primary goals for talisman refinement. In addition, while he was behind closed doors, Han Li also refined 7 or 8 face-setting pills in his free time apart from chi refining pills and ingested one out of curiosity. If it could truly preserve his appearance, Han Li naturally would feel extremely happy. After all, nobody would wish for the day when one becomes white-haired, even if cultivators' fleshly bodies aged at an extremely slow pace. At this time, because his pill had lost its effectiveness, Han Li was incredibly depressed in flight. However, he was still somewhat curious about why his master Li Hueyuan would suddenly want to see him. He couldn't help but guess reasons as to why after 4 years he would take the initiative to seek him out. In this way, Han Li arrived at the Green Ripple Cave, his mind preoccupied with many things. Only after sending a voice transmission did he realize that the one who opened the restrictions for him was no longer that eldest brother Yu, but rather a 20-year-old handsome male with red lips and white teeth. Before Han Li was even able to open his mouth, this youth first said to him indifferently, "It's junior brother Han, right? I am Wu Xuan, Master's 6th disciple. Master wanted me to wait here for you for a while, come with me." After Wu Xuan said this, he didn't even glance at Han Li once and turned around, then left. This caused Han Li to rub his face, baffled. "My face isn't that unpleasant, is it?" Han Li could only somewhat helplessly and unhappily follow closely after him. Naturally, there were no words spoken between them, and they directly arrived at the guest lobby just like that. 3 people were sitting on the chairs in the lobby, and 2 people stood beside them. The people sitting were Li Hueyuan, his wife, and a red-clad woman around 30 years old. Although her appearance was decent and she still possessed some charm, her face was icy cold, faintly revealing a killing intent rarely possessed by cultivators. At this time, Li Hueyuan was seemingly saying something to the woman. Based on his expression and words, he seemed to respect this woman very much. As for the 2 people standing to the side, one was the 4th senior martial brother Song Meng that he had met before. The other was an 18 or 19-year-old young woman, who was also fully clothed in red. Her face could be considered pretty, but she wore a flirty expression, and it seemed from her appearance that she was very closely related to the red-clothed woman. "Han Li, come over and meet your martial senior Hong Fu." Li Hueyuan, upon seeing Han Li walk in, immediately called him over with a happy tone. Then Wu Xuan silently walked over to Song Meng's side, standing with his hands clasped together. Martial Senior Hong Fu. Although Han Li didn't know what was going on, he naturally would not lack respect when it was necessary. The red-clothed woman, upon hearing Han Li's greeting, did not immediately indicate anything. Instead, she closely inspected Han Li from head to toe. After a long while, her face finally revealed a trace of a slight smile, and she said with a somewhat harsh voice, "And very good. It seems like Martial Senior Hong Fu is very satisfied. Although this disciple of mine only has an average appearance, he is genuinely a foundation establishment cultivator. He's also very lovable and clever, having won my heart." Seeing the red-clothed woman's satisfied expression, Li Hueyuan instantly broke out into a smile and began to heap praises upon Han Li. Han Li felt as if he had been drenched in cold water, not knowing the reason why. Chapter 244, Pair Cultivation. Satisfied? What does he mean satisfied? When Han Li heard this, he did not know why he felt uneasy. All he knew was that when he heard Li Hueyuan incessantly praise him again, he had an even worse premonition. Furthermore, he already discovered that ever since he entered the room, that young woman had shot several stealthy glances at him with an expression of complete discontent. In addition, when this martial senior Hong Fu said that he was very good, his figure slightly shook and he hastily lowered his head. Meanwhile, a gaze filled with hostility swept toward Han Li, frightening him for a moment. He couldn't help but return the gaze. It was actually 7th senior martial brother Wu Xuan who had previously introduced him. When Wu Xuan saw Han Li respond to his gaze, his face contorted with surprise. He immediately shifted his gaze with a guilty appearance. When Han Li saw this, he was filled with suspicion. However, his expression maintained his usual patient and calm expression. Seeing him instinctively maintain his calm, the red-clothed woman inwardly continued to nod her head. It will be this child. I feel like he is very suitable. I will first return with Xuan and will calmly wait for good news from martial disciple. The red-clothed woman suddenly said as she nodded her head. Senior martial sister, be at ease. I will surely make the proper arrangements. Li Huayuan saw that the woman wanted to leave, so he hastily consented and saw them both out. As Han Li regained his senses, Martial Senior Hong Fu had already left with that young woman. When Li Huayuan and his wife brought Han Li and the others to the main hall, they were beaming with happiness, both smiling without saying a word. The two returned to their seats and sized up Han Li without end. It was unknown what intention they had. Han Li, as your master, I must first congratulate you. Li Huayuan happily looked at Han Li for a moment before suddenly saying such senseless words. This caused Han Li's heart to beat harder and be even more uneasy. Disciple truly doesn't know what to be happy about. Master, please enlighten me, Han Li respectfully said with a dark foreboding dwelling in his heart. Zixi, this is an extraordinary matter. When your martial senior Hong Fu saw you, she was interested in having you and that disciple of hers to form a bond as pair cultivation companions. The young woman did not wait for Li Huayuan to reply and was the first to unravel the riddle, causing Han Li to become dumbstruck. Become pair cultivation companions, Han Li muttered and became despondent. This was far too surprising. What is this? This is a fine thing that others dream of having but can't obtain. You should know that female cultivation disciples are originally few in number. Those capable of cultivating to foundation establishment are pathetically fewer. Also, pair cultivation a mutually beneficial method to enormously advance the cultivation of both sides. Others will not be able to find such a boon even with a lantern, Li Huayuan said with a happy expression. With what he said, to be able to form a relationship with martial ancestor Hong Fu, who possessed profound magic power, was greatly advantageous. Who didn't know that this female immortal Hong Fu stood near the top of ratings in the state of Yue for core formation cultivators? In Yellow Maple Valley, her magic power was only second to the great ancestor. After thinking about the benefits of forming a close relationship between disciples, Li Huayuan had a dignified, old-fashioned bearing and chuckled continuously. This disciple had never thought of pair cultivation before. This is truly unexpected. Moreover, there are so many male cultivators with appearances and aptitudes far greater than this disciple. How could she come to find me? With his wits returned, Han Li could only bravely reply to his question. However, this caused him to remain greatly perplexed. This is disciple's good luck. Your martial ancestor Hong Fu previously had an emotional wound when she was young and came to completely loathe frivolous, handsome men. Thus, she came to select a companion for her disciple. Naturally, males she finds unpleasant to the eye were beneath her consideration. As such, finding a disciple with a similar age and looks that do not disgust her could not be found with the several hundreds of foundation establishment disciples inside Yellow Maple Valley. Your martial senior Hong Fu has visited several immortals' caves similar to your master, and you were the first one she saw that she was completely satisfied with, Li Huayuan said with satisfaction. As for aptitude, your martial senior isn't particularly picky. The disciple of your martial senior, that young woman who stood at her side today, although her aptitude isn't nearly as ridiculous as your own, she is also mediocre and isn't exceptional in any way. I heard that she had to take 3 foundation establishment pills and many precious medicines in order to barely reach foundation establishment. If it weren't for the fact that she was a close descendant of your martial ancestor, there absolutely wouldn't be much reason to spend such a large amount of attention on that girl. But because of their relationship, the girl received much favor, Li Huayuan explained to Han Li. He then nodded for a moment and sighed, continuing, Actually, in the start, I hadn't thought to recommend you but instead call forth your 7th senior martial brother. After all, whether it's appearance or aptitude, your senior martial brother Wu Xuan exceeds you by no small amount. Although I knew that your martial senior Hong Fu has some prejudice against handsome men, I held a slight hope to try for a fluke. You should know what resulted. Your senior martial brother Wu was unable to pass by your martial senior and was denied, though I did see that Dong girl greatly approve. After Li Huayuan said this, he looked at Wu Xuan, causing his face to become very red and be at a complete loss. Han Li suddenly realized why his senior martial brother was hostile and cold towards him. It was because he had been eliminated as a candidate. It seemed he and the young woman had taken a liking to each other. However, Li Hueyuan's words "dong girl" caused Han Li to recall of the matter of senior martial brother Lu, whom he had previously killed. TL. The Dong Girl and Martial Senior Hong Fu were first mentioned in Chapter 166 by Senior Martial Brother Wu, who wanted to rape Junior Martial Sister Chen. On the night of Senior Martial Brother Lu's brutal display, he seemed to have mentioned the name of that Dong Girl and martial ancestor Hong Fu. Could it be that this girl had been on good terms with that wretched ingrate? With that thought, Han Li felt uncomfortable from head to toe. His impression of Martial Senior Hong Fu's disciple immediately dropped down without the slightest good opinion towards her. After he heard Li Hueyuan's analysis, he felt that he had to thoroughly extinguishing this matter. In truth, Han Li wasn't particularly opposed to pair cultivation, let alone if the other party was a disciple of a core formation cultivator. Becoming a Dao companion with such a figure would bring endless benefits. He didn't immediately agree with apprehension, as the secrets he held were too many. He truly couldn't allow for anyone to stick close to him. As of current, Han Li couldn't agree to such an absurd matter. He had no interest in picking up a companion. Furthermore, that Dong girl should have a favorable impression toward young, confident, and handsome men. She simply wouldn't fancy him. With this thought, Han Li hesitated for a moment and said somewhat unnaturally, "Disciple feels that this is somewhat inappropriate. On one hand, this is somewhat too unexpected. Disciple hadn't prepared himself in the slightest. On the other hand, Disciple saw that Martial Senior Hong Fu's disciple wasn't satisfied toward this disciple. Although Senior Hong Fu may be strongly pressuring her, creating a good chance for Disciple, in the end a strongly wrung melon isn't sweet. Master, please look for another disciple and give him a try. Perhaps there would be a more appropriate candidate than this disciple." When those words left Han Li's mouth, the intent of rejection in those words was undoubtable, slightly surprising Li Hueyuan and his wife. The young woman seemed to have thought of something but didn't speak. His master wrinkled his brow and seemed somewhat irritated. "You hear this out. Your master has already patted his chest, agreeing to this matter with your martial senior Hong Fu. How could I go back on it? Even if there were more appropriate candidates, your master would not go back on his word. As for your worries that the girl isn't willing, that is a matter not worth fussing about. Of us cultivators, how many Dao companions are there that immediately have affinity for one another? Even if they spent a long time with each other, they naturally wouldn't all be completely harmonious." Li Hueyuan had a somewhat strict tone. His words faintly carried a trace of rebuke. When Han Li heard this, he inwardly complained without end, but when he immediately searched for an excuse, he was unable to find one. But at this moment, the young woman suddenly said a few words that startled Li Hueyuan, finally breaking the siege on Han Li. "Han Li, you and that Dong girl entered the sect around the same time, and your time to enter Foundation establishment wasn't too far from hers as well. During this time, have you heard the rumors flowing around?" Rumors? The young woman's words stunned Li Hueyuan. He couldn't help but ask this with surprise. When he saw Han Li's silent tacit agreement, he felt even more surprised. "This was something that several close friends and I chatted about a few times. I heard a few bits of rumors, but they most certainly couldn't be true." The young woman faintly bit her lips, as if she were embarrassed to have said this. "You two leave for a bit. Han Li by himself will be enough." When Li Hueyuan saw his wife act as such, he muttered to himself for a moment. Then he waved his hand, gesturing for Song Meng and Wu Xuan to leave the guest room. Han Li was now the only disciple inside. Song Meng was indifferent. When he heard the order, he saluted and asked to be excused. Although that Wu Xuan didn't dare to disobey his master and closely followed behind Song Meng, there was a trace of unwillingness on his face. He looked at Han Li with a rather peculiar gaze. After Han Li noticed this, he sunk into deep thought. Chapter 245. A Long Journey and Mishaps. "Now there are no outsiders here anymore. Why doesn't Madame speak the truth? That way I can determine what appropriate action to take, lest there be anything that I didn't consider appropriately," Li Hueyuan said, his expression respectful. When the young wife heard this, she glanced at Han Li, who was scratching his head and smiling bitterly, then finally opened her mouth and said, "In the past 2 years, I unintentionally heard a few pieces of information concerning this matter, but whether they're true or not, I don't know. From hearsay, this martial senior Hong Fu's female disciple is not restrained at all in the matters between males and females. When she was in the chi condensation stage, she had unclear relationships with numerous males. People have even privately fought for her, almost leading to disciples from the same sect killing each other. In the end, martial senior Hong Fu flew into a rage when she found out, grounding her to the confines of her cave and increasing supervision until she established her foundation, at which point she was released again. But not too long after, word spread that she had gotten into a relationship with the young master of the Feng clan and seemingly intended to cultivate as a pair with him. However, martial senior Hong Fu hates people from the Feng clan the most, so she naturally would not agree to this matter and locked her up again. In the past 2 years, no such news has spread. Because there was no solid evidence to support these claims, I never paid any attention to them. Thus, when martial senior Hong Fu took her disciple along to visit, I didn't think about this matter. Now, seeing Han Li's extremely unhappy appearance, I felt that it was somewhat strange and suddenly remembered the rumors. The young woman's somewhat apologetic remarks caused both Han Li and Li Hueyuan to become slightly dazed upon hearing them. Li Hueyuan had never expected that the young woman surnamed Dong would actually have such a sloppy reputation, yet he had so hastily agreed to martial senior Hong Fu's requests. How could this be a good thing? Likewise, Han Li naturally did not expect that this young woman not only had an unclear relationship with senior martial brother Lu, but she actually had such a long string of lovers that even Han Li did not know how extensive it was. This rendered him to speechless once again. Wife, are you speaking the truth? Is martial senior Hong Fu's disciple's reputation really so poor? Li Hueyuan asked in disbelief. He could restrain himself no longer and stood up, then began to pace anxiously around the room continuously. This was no longer simply a question of whether or not Han Li was willing to pair cultivate anymore. If he really allowed his own disciple to accept such a woman, his own reputation would definitely not improve. I don't know, because this matter was somewhat carelessly mentioned by someone else. Perhaps even the person who told me this doesn't know whether it's true or not. The young woman sighed helplessly. Upon hearing these words, Han Li rolled his eyes and cried out loudly in his heart. What do you mean? You don't know if it's real or not? At least this little girl definitely had an unclear relationship with senior martial brother Lu. Otherwise, how could he so easily try to kill his former female companion? Of course, Han Li wouldn't say these words out loud. Instead, he stood awkwardly in the same spot, acting as if he were saying, "As long as you know about this matter, I'll be okay, madame." This caused Li Hueyuan to immediately feel a headache coming on upon seeing him. Now that he knew about what had happened, Li Hueyuan naturally would not force Han Li to agree to this matter, even he had intentions of reneging. However, this martial senior Hong Fu was not a person to carelessly slander. In addition, his reason for reneging was not appropriate to talk about plainly. How could he not feel incredibly vexed? After Li Hueyuan paced around the room a number of times, he still couldn't think of any strategies. After his eyes slanted, he discovered that Han Li was still standing to the side, eagerly awaiting for his reply as his master. He couldn't help but feel even more dispirited in his heart and said with no happiness, "You can return first. When your master's wife and I have discussed this matter, we will let you know how we are going to deal with this matter, all right." Anxiously standing to the side, Han Li was also worried that the other person wouldn't care about the facts of the situation, forcing him to agree to this matter of pair cultivation. But now, upon hearing Li Hueyuan's instructions, his heart relaxed, knowing that this matter would most likely not go through. Thus, he agreed extremely happily and slipped out. Then Han Li hurriedly flew away from the cave under the watchful gazes of Song Meng and Wu Xuan, who were standing guard outside the large lobby. Han Li finally received Li Hueyuan's voice transmission talisman after 3 uneasy days. In the end, upon hearing the results of the negotiations between his master and martial senior Hong Fu, Han Li couldn't help but look up at the sky and let out a huge sigh. Half a month later, in front of Green Ripple Cave's waterfall, Li Hueyuan and his wife, as well as female immortal Hong Fu, were all there to send 2 people off. These 2 people were about to undertake a long journey but wore somewhat stiff expressions, only submissively answering incessantly. They did not possess any of the excitement that people who were about to take a long journey would normally have. This male and female pair was Han Li and female immortal Hong Fu's disciple, Dong Xuaner. Han Li, on this trip you two must be careful and help each other out. I heard that the cultivation world hasn't been so peaceful lately, and cultivators will often disappear. At first, it was just Qi condensation disciples, but recently even Foundation establishment cultivators have been involved in accidents. Although Li Hueyuan had only exhorted Han Li simply with a few sentences before the two of them left, Han Li still felt quite moved in his heart. However, Marshal Senior Hong Fu's words to the young woman were a big eye-opener to Han Li. During this entire trip, you have to listen to your senior marshal brother Han's words and behave yourself. If anything happens this time, don't blame me on not speaking my feelings as your master. Marshal Senior Hong Fu's extremely blunt words caused the young woman's face to turn deathly pale, and she repeatedly nodded her head, wearing an extremely pitiful appearance. Han Li and Dong Xuaner both flew into the air on their magic tools, then flew towards the south, disappearing along the horizon. As Li Hueyuan watched the dots of light from these two people slowly disappear, he suddenly and somewhat anxiously said to female immortal Hong Fu, "Does Marshal Senior really have the faith to allow those two people represent you and me at the Yan clan's treasure-seizing assembly? You surely know that those two have only just established their foundations not too long ago. They don't even stand a chance. What, does Marshal Junior Li fear that not sending competent disciples will damage your reputation? Or are you regretful about the Yin-Yang Tower treasure talisman that the Yan clan is taking out this time?" Female immortal Hong Fu rebuked, glancing sideways at Li Hueyuan. This caused him to laugh bitterly. "Of course my husband does not have this intention, but I wonder, why didn't Marshal Senior Hong Fu send out her strongest disciples? Han Li and young Lady Dong, when compared to those true Foundation establishment experts, definitely won't withstand even a single blow. Does Marshal Senior want to use this opportunity to pair the two together?" The young woman gently explained for Li Hueyuan after gently laughing once. "Junior Marshal brother Li, your wife really is a good wife. It's not like I didn't have this kind of intention. Of course it would be best if she could develop a relationship with your disciple along the way. However, this was not my original intention. My main purpose is still for Xuaner to experience some setbacks during this trip to the Yan clan and kill off some of her arrogance. I heard that the Yan clan has a young woman with heavenly spiritual roots who will also be attending this treasure-seizing assembly. In this way, Xuaner will be able to realize the difference between her and true geniuses, instead of believing that she is extraordinary among female Foundation establishment cultivators and not knowing how things really stand. Because she was the only descendant of my deceased elder brother, I've pampered her too much. She actually dared to do such indecent things, creating such scandals by mixing with a few male disciples. She completely corrupted her clean reputation as a woman. If I hadn't examined her body many times to ensure that she had preserved her virginity, I would have exterminated her with one palm, lest others think that our Dong clan produced such a dishonest woman." The red-clothed woman said these things coldly, but at the very end it seemed as if her words were referring to something. This caused Li Hueyuan and his wife to glance at each other, having understood the meaning in her words, their faces revealing awkward expressions. One day, Li Hueyuan and his wife had gathered up their courage to stammeringly bring up the matter of reneging on the arrangement with this Marshal Senior Hong Fu. In the end, greatly outside of his expectations, this Marshal Senior of his, whose temper was normally not too good, actually let out a soft sigh and agreed. This caused the two of them to become extremely happy. However, Hong Fu still raised one condition, which was that Han Li would accompany Dong Xuaner on a trip outside to attend the upcoming treasure-seizing assembly, hosted by the Yan clan. The state of Yue's #1 clan, the Yan clan, had invited disciples of core formation experts from the few neighboring states to gather together in their treasure-seizing assembly, most likely to improve relations with all the core formation cultivators and benefit the Yan clan's future expansion. They had even taken out the legendary Yin-Yang Tower treasure talisman this time to serve as the #1 prize. Of course, there were also a substantial amount of other unique treasures, magic tools, and spiritual medicines. Thus, many core formation cultivators who received the invitation all sent out their strongest disciples to attend this great assembly. After all, that Yin-Yang Tower treasure talisman was something that even core formation cultivators greatly coveted. Of course, because of distance constraints, the chance that core formation cultivators outside of the state of Yue would send people to participate was not too high. Instead, it was still cultivators from the state that made up the majority of the participants. When Li Hueyuan heard the other person's conditions, he initially felt that to allow Han Li to participate with his weak cultivation base in this year's Great Assembly was truly too big of a waste. However, upon considering it once more, he realized that his two strongest disciples were out taking care of business and would not be able to rush to this year's great assembly. If he were to send other disciples, they definitely wouldn't stand a chance at taking first place. Even if they were to reach other rankings and received a few magic tools or the like, he looked upon them with disdain. Thus, he agreed. Li Huiyuan and his wife originally believed that this matter was over, and so they had wanted to say their goodbyes and then leave. But who know that female immortal Hong Fu suddenly wanted his wife to stay for a while, saying that there were a few matters that she wanted to discuss with her alone. Having said this, she only chased out Li Huiyuan, who had a stomach full of doubt. In the end, half a day later, the young master's wife, upon returning from Hong Fu's cave, told Li Huiyuan something that left him dumbstruck. Chapter 246, Dong Chuaner. This martial Aunt Hong Fu brought the young woman to the back room and had her examine the flawless arm of the deeply blushing Dong Chuaner. The gecko cinnabar on it revealed that her chastity was shown to actually be intact. This caused Han Li's master's wife to be greatly shocked. TL, gecko cinnabar supposedly tells if you're a virgin. From the appearance of her flirtatious behavior, how could this Dong Chuaner possibility not have had intercourse? On the day that the couple tried to renege on the matter of pair cultivation, they had pretended to not know of the rumors and remained ambiguous. However, they completely didn't expect that the girl's reputation had long been common knowledge. This very matter was what drove the couple to renege on their agreement for the sake of their reputation. While the young woman was astonished, Hong Fu explained to her. Because her disciple desired the wondrous effect of preserving her appearance, she had first cultivated the top-grade magic technique she had on hand, the spring transformation art, which altered the bearing of her appearance through cultivation. A few cultivators with women essence identification techniques had seen Dong Chuaner and assumed she had already lost her virginity, giving birth to many unflattering rumors. TL, the spring Chinese letter in spring transformation art can also mean joy, lust, and youth. It was without a doubt that this disciple truly did not care much for her own reputation, and actually had a rather familiar relationship with many male cultivators. However, because of the seductive effect of the spring transformation arts along with her extraordinary status, to have no illicit affairs with any of the male cultivators who were circling around her was a truly remarkable and unexpected matter. However, the male cultivators who stayed by her side grew more numerous as Dong Chuaner gradually formed a habit of shooting flirty looks at young men, immediately planting the strange notion that she wanted them to get underneath her skirt. This even went far enough as to cause discord between a few men, all rivals for her affection. Fortunately, as a prerequisite for Hong Fu allowing this girl to cultivating the spring transformation art, she was not allowed to throw away her chastity. If she didn't find any trace of the gecko cinnabar, Master Hong Fu would have immediately dispersed her magic power and would have forced her to live on as a mortal. This was to prevent Dong Chuaner, who had bewitchment techniques from cultivating the spring transformation art, from ruining the principles of the Dong clan. Underneath very restrictive conditions, although Dong Chuaner had often sent flirting glances at these young men, she hadn't dared to step too far out of line. However, these small antics slowly reached Hong Fu's ears and caused this female core formation cultivator to become furious. She firmly punished Dong Chuaner and immediately confined her in a restrictive formation for a period of time. But it was already too late, and Dong Chuaner's terrible reputation had already spread throughout Yellow Maple Valley. This rumor had quickly spread and was fundamentally impossible to stifle. Even the core formation cultivator Hong Fu was unable to do anything about this. Currently, even if those cultivators who knew of her reputation found out that Dong Chuaner had truly remained chaste, they wouldn't dare to become pair cultivation companions for the sake of preserving their own reputation. However, she had reached a stage of cultivation for spring transformation, where she was required to pair cultivate in order to progress her magic power, else it would regress. As for those cultivators who still sought Dong Chuaner, Hong Fu did not find any that satisfied her, finding faults in their moral character and lewd attempts. But eventually, she made a trip to Li Huiyuan's Immortals cave and chose Han Li. Having heard all of this, the young woman wore a very embarrassed expression and returned to Li Huiyuan's side. After she told her husband, they both remained silent for a good amount of time. Although the couple had truly mistaken Dong Chuaner's purity, it was as Hong Fu had said. Even if she had remained truly chaste, her reputation was truly spoiled, preventing Li Huiyuan from willingly allowing his own disciple from being pair cultivation companions with her, since the damage to his own reputation would be far too great. Thus, he could only feel guilt toward this martial Aunt Hong Fu. In order to make up for his guilt toward Hong Fu, Li Hueyuan naturally didn't obstruct Han Li's trip to the treasure-seizing assembly in the slightest. Instead, he spared no effort to facilitate this long trip for Han Li and Dong Xuan'er. In Li Hueyuan's mind, with regards toward Han Li's terrible impression toward Dong Xuan'er, this long trip would change nothing. In truth, ever since his seventh disciple Wu Xuan had first seen Dong Xuan'er, that girl had constantly remained in his mind. Several days before, he had actually summoned to courage to ask Li Hueyuan whether or not he could raise the issue to Hong Fu to see if she would reconsider Wu Xuan. Naturally, Li Hueyuan couldn't agree to such an absurd action. After fiercely rebuking this disciple, he sent the disciple out to handle external affairs to avoid having Wu Xuan stir up trouble within the mountain. After the strict scolding, Wu Xuan became much more obedient and obeyed orders to handle matters. But Li Hueyuan was still clearly able to feel this disciple's wily thoughts were still present. He couldn't help but sense an oncoming headache. After seeing off the two young cultivators, female immortal Hong Fu chatted with the husband and wife a bit more before departing. Li Hueyuan and the young woman entered Green Ripple Cave and started their daily cultivation, as the matter of Han Li and Dong Xuan'er had been set aside for the time being. The number one clan of the state of Yue, the Yang clan, had its foundation in the unremarkable Lin province. Not only was the area of this province ordinary, but the population was also of an average number. It could be said to be a completely ordinary land. Qingliang Town was a common small town of the Lin province. Were it not for the exceptional scenery of Yanliang Mountain, there wasn't anything that the population could have said to distinguish this place from any other. The Yan clan's most important location, Yanling Castle, was located within Yanliang Mountain. Currently, Han Li held a sheet of paper in his hand. This was the invitation letter to the treasure-seizing assembly. The location of the assembly's meeting place was written on it, Yanling Castle. After taking another look at the invitation letter and seeing that he wasn't mistaken, Han Li calmly put it away. Then he heard mocking words of ridicule from the girl at his side. "You really are a blockhead. You actually read the invitation letter 5 or 6 times through and still don't feel ease. You truly have no small amount of shortcomings." This young woman's voice was very soft, yet it contained a deep allure. It was very capable of charming males and would even drive younger men wilder. However, Han Li's expression didn't change in the slightest. It was as if he hadn't heard her. He unexpectedly raised his hand and shot 3 bowl-sized fireballs to the sky, erupting when they were high enough. He then insipidly said, "If the Yang clan still doesn't send people to us after another moment, then we will leave and wait until tomorrow. Junior Marshal Sister, since you have enough energy to quarrel, you may as well keep an eye out at a higher area and see if there is anyone else nearby just in case." Senior Marshal Brother Han's guts are truly very small. We are at the entrance of the Yang clan, and you still believe there are any dangers. I see that you are a completely foolish and paranoid person. Dong Xuan'er slanted her red lips and lazily said this. She leaned against a pine tree without the slightest intent of obeying. At this moment, Han Li and the young woman stood at the peak of a somewhat small mountain, waiting for something to happen. This was where the invitation letter indicated they would pick up guests. However, the two had arrived a while ago, but they still hadn't seen anyone from the Yang clan. Han Li couldn't help but grow greatly alert for fear there would be some mishap. However, this little princess, Dong viewed Han Li's cautiousness with contempt, believing Han Li was merely cowardly. It has already been 7 or 8 days since they left Green Ripple Cave. But on the journey, perhaps due to having inharmonious dispositions, the two found each other rather displeasing to the eye. A man and a woman would have feelings toward each other during such a long journey, but with them, not the slightest feeling had developed. Dong Xuan'er did not know why her bewitching flirts that had charmed hundreds of male cultivators hadn't the slightest effect on Han Li. Because of her wicked disposition, not long after she failed to control Han Li, she burst out, releasing a great temper. However, Han Li didn't pay attention to the young girl and fundamentally ignored her rudeness. He only uttered one sentence, "I can tell Marshal Aunt Hong Fu the exact words you just said." This immediately stifled Dong Xuan'er. Although the young woman was accustomed to being spoiled with affection, she knew that Hong Fu was truly furious regarding her own reputation. She truly took to heart the warning she was given when she had departed. If the loathable man before her truly told her master a few unpleasant words, heavy criticism would be unavoidable. Even locking her up again wouldn't be out of the question. Recalling her last period of confinement, Dong Xuan'er couldn't help but shiver. Although she wasn't willing to be completely subdued, she didn't dare to act as recklessly as before. However, Han Li didn't make it too difficult for her, even allowing the girl to have cheap victories in verbal exchanges, not caring in the least. But if Dong Xuan'er was the slightest bit excessive, he would bluntly bring up Marshal Senior Hong Fu, immediately rigidly suppressing Dong Xuan'er without the slightest leeway. After all, before departure, Hong Fu had spoken to the two, allowing Han Li to hear her stern warning. On the journey, as this girl eloquently mocked and taunted him without end, as if he hadn't heard her words, Han Li only hurried on the journey. But when he insipidly mentioned Hong Fu's words, the originally eloquent Xuan'er's expression greatly changed, and she didn't dare to be so impudent. Thus, the two hurried on their journey as they clashed during the day and slept during the night. Several days later, they eventually reached the peak of Yan Liang Mountain. However, they were greeted by unexpected silence. The people from the Yan clan should have already appeared, but the two of them have had to wait for over half a day, causing them to be a bit impatient. Chapter 247 Yan Siblings. Chapter 247 Yan Siblings. Perhaps they had been too impatient, but to the sky west of the mountain peak, two black dots eventually appeared. Two huge, two-headed demonic birds gradually flew closer. They were the two-headed ducks he had previously seen at the Great South Gathering. Saddled upon the demonic beasts were a man and a woman. When she saw that strangers had appeared, the originally lazy Dong Xuan'er immediately roused her spirit and stood straight. She curiously stared at the large two-headed birds as they approached. "We are truly sorry for having you two wait so long. This one is Yan Yu. The other is Yan Ling, my younger sister. We have come to bring you to Yan Ling Castle." When the two ducks flew onto the mountain peak, the man and woman immediately jumped off. The young man firmly stood and said this with an apologetic tone. "It is no matter, we also didn't wait very long." Before Han Li could even open his mouth, Dong Xuan'er daintily said this with bright eyes after having seen this heroic-looking man, Yan Yu. Her voice was extremely smooth, causing Han Li to raise his eyebrow upon hearing her. Hearing Dong Xuan'er's new voice, it was as if the wicked and unruly woman he spent the past few days with had transformed into a girl from a noble house. Yan Yu naturally did not know of this. When he saw Dong Xuan'er, a young woman as pretty as a flower, and heard her soft words aimed at him, his heart immediately shook and a peculiar feeling rose. He straightened his back and brightly said, "Actually, there were Yan clan disciples waiting here for guests. However, the disciples that were waiting here had to take care of some mishap. As such, there was no one here and you two were neglected. On behalf of the Yan clan, I, Yan Yu, apologize to the two of you and hope you do not take offense." When Dong Xuan'er heard this, she wore a smooth smile, and attraction flashed through her eyes. Just as she thought to say something else, Han Li's dull voice suddenly reached her ear. "With Junior Marshal Sister's appearance, aren't you afraid of the repercussions from Marshal Senior Hong Fu?" When she heard this, Dong Xuan'er's expression greatly changed. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. This bizarre scene caused the Yan siblings to be a bit puzzled. Yan Ling was a young woman that was 15 or 16 years old. She seemed to be a lively and charming person. She continuously switched her gaze between Han Li and Dong Xuan'er with her bright black eyes, giving people the impression that she was extremely clever. It was as Junior Marshal Sister Dong had said. "It was nothing. You were only a bit late. This one is certain that the Yan clan wouldn't deliberately treat guests coldly. However, I'm a bit baffled. What sort of mishap did the disciples who were originally here to receive guests encounter? Could it be that they clashed against guests?" Stopping Dong Xuan'er's careless use of the spring transformation art seduction, Han Li lightly coughed 2 times and said a few polite words. He then made an inquiry of this mishap that was mentioned under the guise of a joke. When Yan Yu heard Han Li's words, his face wore a difficult expression. It was as if he were troubled about something and couldn't say it clearly. "Han Li, since it isn't convenient for this senior martial brother Yu, don't bother him as you wish. We should first travel to Yan Ling Castle and take a look. There should already be quite a few people there, yes." "That's right. Let us go to Yan Ling Castle. There have already been many guests who arrived. They are currently discussing cultivation insights and are making all kinds of exchanges. Let us go now so you two should be able to participate." When Dong Xuan'er saw Yan Yu hesitate a bit, she said a few friendly words on his behalf and caused that Yan clan disciple to greatly relax. He repeatedly agreed, and his good feelings toward Dong Xuan'er grew even greater. At the side, Yan Ling faintly became aware of Dong Chuaner's bad intentions and unhappily pouted with her small mouth. At this moment, without paying heed to Dong Chuaner, Han Li only faintly smiled and nodded his head in agreement, saying, "Then I must ask Senior Marshal Brother Yan and Young Lady Yan to lead the way. Junior Marshal Sister Dong and I are fine following from behind." Noticing that Han Li didn't further press the question, Yan Yu grew happier. Then he said apologetically, "I will first lead the way. I must ask that you diligently keep close. I hope you do not take offense." Although Yan Yu said this politely, Han Li clearly sensed that his words were largely directed to Dong Chuaner. It seemed that this Yan clan disciple had already quickly fallen to Dong Chuaner's gentle grasp. Han Li inwardly laughed coldly several times. He was disinterested in getting involved with Dong Chuaner's absurd matters and feigned ignorance. Then he took out Li Huayuan's invitation letter, nimbly handing it over to Yan Yu. That Dong Chuaner also took out her invitation letter from female immortal Hong Fu and handed it over with her slim, lily-white hands. The alluring scent of her body and the luster of her jade-white skin dazzled Yan Yu for a moment, and he actually forgot to accept the letter. His little sister was no longer able to stand idle and angrily took the invitation in place of Yan Yu. Her elder brother was then woken up by Dong Chuaner's soft chuckles, causing him to deeply blush. There are no problems with Junior Marshal Brother Han and Junior Marshal Sister Dong's invitation cards. Let us set off then. After Yan Yu handed back their invitations, he mounted the two-headed duck, feeling strange. He occasionally stole a few glances at Dong Chuaner on the way, but at this moment, that wicked and unruly girl was actually displaying a decent and honorable appearance. This caused the Yan clan elite's imagination to run wild. The four leaped off the ground in succession and headed straight back to where Yan clan siblings had come from. After flying for tens of kilometers, the group landed at an area between two mountains. At this moment, Yan Yu searched for a command tile he had on hand and firmly held it with both hands, violently pouring spiritual power into it. Suddenly, the command tile emitted a magnificent yellow mist of light over a large area, shooting toward the empty area ahead of them. When the yellow light swept past the originally empty area, a rainbow-colored thread of light suddenly appeared. Then this rainbow streak of light flashed and scattered before their eyes, revealing an imposing ancient castle in the originally empty mountain ridge. It seemed the huge walls reached about 100 meters in height. There were even countless tall buildings that reached over the walls. Han Li and Dong Chuaner felt this was rather unfamiliar and a bit too much to take in. "This is our Yan clan's most important location, Yanling Castle. We are honored to welcome Junior Marshal Brother Han and Junior Marshal Sister Dong." Yan Yu suddenly straightened his appearance before solemnly saying this. Han Li smiled. Just as he thought to say something, at his side Dong Chuaner suddenly yelped, "Yi!" She gazed at the castle with an expression full of shock. Seeing the girl with such an expression, Han Li naturally followed her gaze. He only saw a martial competition staged to the side of a castle with two floating, differently dressed male disciples in a confrontation. One was wearing the brown clothes of the Yan clan, a man with a swift and fierce appearance. The other had a curled beard, gray eyes, dark skin, and yellow hair. He was wearing an azure robe. He appeared quite strange. There was a giant barrier of white light enveloping the stage. The barrier seemed to be sparkling. Outside of the light barrier there stood two crowds, one to the east and one to the west. What was most eye-catching were the types of clothing worn by the two crowds. One of the crowds were standing in formation and were absolutely silent, having the bearing of regular training. They were those from the Yan clan. The other crowd mostly consisted of eccentrics with curly beards. They were all wearing green robes and had green eyes and yellow hair. There were also a few average people in there. After Han Li clearly saw this, he wore a somewhat amazed expression. He could not help but look at the Yan siblings to his side. Perhaps they had an explanation. Without waiting for Han Li to open his mouth, Yan Yu's expression became a bit unnatural after watching this scene. To the side, Yan Ling clenched a fist and said completely furiously, "They actually started another challenge. They even act so viciously. This is truly outrageous." When Han Li heard this, his heart shook. He then asked a probing question, could it be that these people aren't the Yan clan's guests? Naturally they are. These fellows came knocking on our door and injured two of our disciples, a 15-year-old junior marshal brother and a 16-year-old junior marshal brother. Furthermore, they insisted on participating in the treasure-seizing assembly. I don't know what the elders were thinking, but they actually agreed. This is truly infuriating. Yan Ling hadn't noticed Yan Yu's gaze, a clear sign for her to stop, but she continued unrestrained, releasing a girl's small temper. When Han Li saw this, he couldn't help but laugh. Yan Yu then wore an embarrassed expression, not knowing what to say. It seems this is the main reason why we were waiting on the mountain peak for so long. Could Senior Marshal Brother Yu tell Xuaner a few details? Without Han Li needing to inquire, Dong Xuaner curiously hooked onto Yan Yu as if she had bewitched him. After a moment of hesitation, Yan Yu gave a straightforward answer. These people arrived this morning at our Yan Ling castle. When they arrived outside the castle, they had no invitations and wanted to break through, injuring two of the junior marshal brothers who were receiving guests. When the other disciples hurried after, received the request for help, intending to teach these fellows a lesson. They did not think that these people would actually take out a letter and a token that actually made the squad elders grow solemn. They even swallowed their words and courteously invited them into the castle. However, these people didn't know their place, and immediately after entering Yan Ling Castle, they requested the Yan clan to exchange pointers with them. After some consideration from the elders, they agreed to give them a bit of difficulty. The competition would be 10 matches, all between Foundation establishment disciples. I fought 2 competitions ago for several matches. As for the results, Yan Yu shook his head, his expression somewhat mournful. It was clear that the Yan clan was in a disadvantageous position.